The wagon driver's voice cut through the frozen air like a slap. "Hey boys, come look at this." Old Mercer sent all the way to Caldwell for a cook, and they went and sent him that. Laughter broke out from the men gathered near the trading post steps. 3 of them, maybe 4, the kind of men who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday than stand around and find someone smaller to make themselves feel larger. Except the woman climbing down from the wagon wasn't small. She was broad-shouldered, full-figured, wrapped in a coat that had been mended at the elbows twice over, and she was holding a baby on her hip while her boots found the icy ground one careful step at a time. "Gonna need a wider doorway up at Mercer's place," one of them called out. More laughter. She didn't look at them. That was the thing that silenced Silas Mercer where he stood. She'd clearly heard every word, and she simply did not look. If this woman's quiet courage already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay close, because what happens next on this mountain will stay with you long after the snow melts. The morning Silas Mercer rode down from the high pasture and into the supply town of Dunbar Crossing, he had exactly one thing on his mind: food that didn't taste like regret. He'd spent the better part of 4 years eating what he could manage on his own, which wasn't much. Scorched beans, dried elk that took 20 minutes of chewing to get down. Twice he'd burned a pot of oatmeal so badly he'd had to throw the pot out with the food still in it, and he'd grown up poor enough that throwing out a pot was the kind of thing that kept a man awake at night. He was 41 years old, lean and weathered in the way that high country winters produce in men who refuse to quit, and somewhere in the past year he'd crossed a line from getting by to barely holding on. The ranch itself was sound. 300 acres tucked against the eastern face of the Gray Wall Range, where the timber was thick and the creek ran clear and cold through all 4 seasons. He'd built the cabin with his own hands 12 years back, added the barn the following spring, sunk a proper well the year after that. The cattle were managed, the fences were tight, the land was producing. But the man who ran it was running hollow, and he was practical enough to admit it. He hadn't wanted a wife. He'd thought about it once, years ago, but the woman he'd had in mind had taken one look at the isolation of the mountain life and chosen a merchant in town instead, and he'd made his peace with that eventually. What he needed wasn't companionship. He needed someone who could cook a meal that didn't make him dread sitting down at his own table. He needed someone who could manage a kitchen and keep the stores organized through the long months when the pass road iced over and no supply wagon could reach him. He'd spoken to Gerald Pratt at the Dunbar Freight Office about it in early September, keeping his voice flat and businesslike the way he kept everything. "I need a cook," he'd said. "Someone who knows what they're doing. Frontier experience preferred. I'll pay fair wages and provide room and board." Season runs October through late April, when the snow's heaviest. After that, they can stay on or not, their choice. Gerald had nodded, made a note, told him he'd send word to the employment office in Caldwell, which handled domestic placements for the outlying ranch districts. Silas had ridden home, put the matter out of his mind, and gone back to his regular life of early mornings and long silences. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now it was the 3rd week of October. The first real cold snap had already arrived, and Gerald had sent a rider up the mountain 2 days prior with word that the cook would be arriving on the Wednesday freight wagon. Silas had ridden down that morning, figuring he'd meet the wagon, load the cook's belongings alongside the winter supplies he'd ordered, and make it back up the mountain pass before the afternoon temperature dropped below what was safe. He hadn't figured on what actually stepped off that wagon. He was standing near the hitching post outside Dunbar's general store when the freight wagon rolled in, and he watched as Gerald Pratt walked over to help with the unloading. The wagon was heavy. Sacks of grain and flour, crates of salted provisions, coils of rope and wire. Silas was already calculating how to distribute the weight on his own pack horse when he heard the wagon driver say something, and then heard the laughter begin. He looked up. She was coming down from the wagon bed carefully, one hand gripping the side rail, the other wrapped around an infant bundled in a wool blanket so that only a small dark-haired head was visible against her shoulder. She was a young woman. He'd put her somewhere around 25, though the exhaustion in her face made it hard to place exactly. She was heavy, noticeably so, the kind of full figure that some men found occasion to remark upon and other men minded their own business about. Her coat was clean but old. Her boots were worn at the heel. When she finally reached the ground and straightened, she shifted the baby to a more settled position on her hip without losing her composure, even as the men near the trading post steps kept laughing. Silas looked at her, then he looked at Gerald. "Gerald," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Who is that woman?" Gerald had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That'd be your cook, Silas. Abigail Foster, out of Caldwell. Widow woman. The employment office said she was the only applicant with kitchen experience who was available for an October start. She has a baby." "Appears so." Silas said nothing for a moment. He watched as Abigail Foster reached the ground and stood still for a breath, orienting herself, looking out at the town with eyes that were careful and composed. She had a travel bag slung over one shoulder. The baby? He could see now it was very young, probably less than a year, was awake and watching the world with the calm, solemn expression that very young children sometimes have when they're too new to know what to be frightened of. One of the men near the trading post called out something that Silas didn't fully hear, but the laughter that followed made the meaning clear enough. Abigail still didn't look at them. That was what moved in him, watching her. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. The particular stillness of someone who has learned through long practice that looking back only feeds what's trying to wound you. He walked over anyway, because standing at a distance wasn't going to solve anything. "Mrs. Foster," he said, stopping a few feet from her. She turned and looked at him directly, and he saw that her eyes were a kind of pale gray-green that was unusual enough to notice. They were steady eyes. Whatever she was feeling about the laughter and the cold and the long journey from Caldwell, none of it was visible in those eyes. "Mr. Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right." He looked at the baby, then back at her. "The agency didn't mention a child." "No," she said. "I expect they didn't." She waited, not filling the silence with excuses or explanations, and he found himself slightly disarmed by that. Most people filled silences. She just stood in it. "I sent for a cook," he said. "Not?" He stopped. "Not a woman with a baby," she said. "I understand." She said it without heat. "If you want to send me back on the return wagon, I'll understand that too. I won't make a scene about it." He looked at her. Then he looked at the baby. Then he looked up at the sky, where a line of cloud was building along the ridge to the northwest, the kind of flat gray cloud that came in off the high country and meant business. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. Something flickered in her expression, just briefly. "Yesterday morning. There wasn't much room in the travel budget for—" "Come on," he said, already turning toward the general store. "I'm not sending anyone back up that road hungry." He heard her footsteps behind him on the frozen ground, careful and steady, and didn't look back to check if she was following. Inside the store, he asked May Dunbar, the owner's wife, who ran the place with more efficiency than her husband and about twice the common sense, to put together something hot from the kitchen and back. May glanced at Abigail with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen every kind of person pass through a frontier supply town, and if she had an opinion about what she saw, she kept it to herself. "Sit down," Silas told Abigail, gesturing toward the bench near the stove. She sat. The baby, dislodged from her hip by the movement, made a small sound and then resettled against her chest, gripping the lapel of her coat with one tiny fist. Silas sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. "How old is the child?" he asked. 9 months. His name is Eli." "Who's his father?" "My late husband," she said. "Thomas Foster. He passed in April." "What from?" "Fever. It came fast." She said it simply, without embellishment. "We'd been farming a small claim outside Caldwell. It wasn't— The claim didn't survive his passing. There were debts." She paused. "I'm good at cooking, Mr. Mercer. I know how to stretch supplies. I know how to put up preserves and smoke meat and manage a larder through a long winter. I've done it before." "On a mountain ranch?" "On a cold farm in bad soil with not enough money. I imagine the skills transfer." He studied her face. She wasn't performing confidence. That was the thing. She was just telling him what was true. May appeared with a bowl of bean soup and 2 thick slices of bread. Abigail looked at it for just a half second before reaching for it, and in that half second Silas saw how hungry she actually was. But she ate carefully, not fast because she was managing the baby on her lap at the same time and didn't want to spill on him. Silas watched without making it obvious he was watching. "The ranch is 3 hours up the pass road," he said. "The pass closes in bad weather, sometimes for weeks. Once you're up there in winter, you're up there. That mean you understand what I'm saying?" "It means I can't change my mind once the snow comes," she said. "Yes, I understand." "The baby too." She looked at him steadily. "I understand, Mr. Mercer." He tapped his finger on the table once, twice. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up along the eaves of the building. The cloud line to the northwest had moved visibly in the past 20 minutes. It was going to snow before nightfall. Whether it was going to be light snow or the kind of heavy, driving storm that shut the pass road down entirely, he couldn't say yet, but he didn't like the look of that sky. He made a decision. It wasn't a warm decision or a generous one. He told himself that clearly. It was practical. Sending a woman with an infant back up that road in a freight wagon with a storm coming was not something he was willing to do, and the reason was purely practical, and he was going to keep telling himself that for the rest of the afternoon. "You'll come up to the ranch," he said. "We'll talk more once we're there and the supplies are unloaded. But I'm not sending you back on that road with weather coming." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said, and stood up. "Finish your soup." She did. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised him a little. Getting the supplies loaded and the pack horse arranged took the better part of an hour. Silas worked efficiently, not wasting time, aware of the sky the whole while. Gerald helped without being asked, which Silas appreciated. A couple of the men who'd been laughing earlier were still hanging around the trading post, and one of them, a trapper named Doyle, who had more mouth than sense on his best days, called over as Silas was lashing down the last of the grain sacks. "You taking her up the mountain, Mercer? She gonna cook for you or just take up half the kitchen?" Silas didn't stop what he was doing. "Doyle," he said, not raising his voice, "you say one more word and I'll put you on your back in that snowbank and leave you there." Doyle read something in Silas's face that persuaded him to find somewhere else to be. Abigail, who had been standing near the wagon with Eli on her hip, had heard all of it. When Silas walked over, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to." He turned to Gerald's young assistant, who was holding the lead rope of the pack horse. "We're ready." The ride up the mountain pass was cold and silent and long, the way it always was. Silas rode his roan mare, and Abigail sat in the small wagon seat behind him, holding Eli wrapped tight against the wind. He glanced back once, maybe halfway up, and saw that she was singing something very quietly to the baby to keep him settled. Not a recognizable song, just a low, tuneless sound that was more warmth than melody. She stopped when she noticed him looking. "Don't stop on my account," he said. She didn't say anything to that, but after a moment he heard it again, softer. The cabin was dark and cold when they arrived, which it always was when he'd been gone all day. He never left a fire burning unattended. He unlocked the door, went in, and got the fire started, then came back to help unload. Abigail stood in the doorway with Eli and looked at the interior of the cabin with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't dismay, exactly. It was more like assessment. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "I had plans for it," he said shortly, and let the rest of that sentence go where it was going, which was nowhere. She stepped inside and walked slowly through the main room. The fireplace, the rough table, the shelves along the north wall where the larder supplies were kept. She opened a few cabinet doors. She looked at the small side room that he'd been using to store equipment and tools. "Is this room being used?" she asked. "Storage." "Could it be cleared enough for a bed and a crib? I brought a folding crib for Eli. It doesn't take much space." He thought about it. "Probably." "I won't ask you to clear it tonight," she said quickly. "We can manage by the fire tonight." "I'll clear it," he said. He didn't know why he said it so fast. "It won't take long." It took about 40 minutes, moving crates and equipment out to the barn, but when he was done there was room for the narrow spare bed that had been folded against the wall, and enough floor space for the small traveling crib she assembled with quick, practiced hands, while Eli sat propped against a rolled blanket and watched her with solemn dark eyes. Silas stood in the doorway and watched her set it up. She worked fast and without wasted movement. You've done that before, he said. Every night for 9 months. She settled Eli into the crib, tucked the blanket around him, and stood up. He'll sleep for a few hours. I can have supper ready before he wakes. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, turning to face him. There was something quiet and firm in her expression. But I'd like to. He got out of her way. What happened in the kitchen over the next hour was something Silas Mercer had not experienced in longer than he could easily say. The smell of actual food, not scorched, not dried out, not barely edible, but real food cooking in a real pot with something that might have been herbs he hadn't known he had, began drifting out from behind the curtain she'd hung over the kitchen doorway to keep the heat in while she worked. He could hear her moving around in there, the soft, efficient sounds of someone who knew what they were doing. The scrape of the cast iron, the steady chop of the knife on the board, occasionally the low sound of her talking to herself, or perhaps to the child, even though the child was in the other room asleep. He sat at the table and pretended to look at his account ledger and did not look at the kitchen doorway. When she came out with 2 bowls and set one in front of him, he looked at it and then looked up at her. "What is this?" he asked. "Venison stew. I found the dried meat in the back of the larder. There was some wild thyme in a tin that still had smell to it, and the carrots and turnips from the supply order. The bread's just a simple pan bread. I'll make a proper batch tomorrow when I know the oven better." He looked at the bowl. "Go ahead," she said, sitting down across from him with her own bowl. "It won't improve from staring at it." He took a spoonful. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "When's the last time I had a real meal?" "I wouldn't know, Mr. Mercer." "Long time," he said. "Long time." She ate her own food without making a fuss about it. Outside, the snow had started. He could hear it now, the first soft hiss of it against the window. He looked up and saw it coming down past the glass, steady and thick. "Storm's here," he said. "Yes?" she said. "I could tell from the sky on the way up." He looked at her. "You could tell from the sky." "My father farmed high ground in Missouri. You learn to read weather, or you get caught by it." She paused. "It's going to be a long night. Maybe 2 days of heavy snow." He leaned back in his chair and considered the situation with the flat, methodical honesty that had always served him better than feelings. There was a woman in his cabin. She had a baby. She had nowhere else to go, and a storm outside the window making the question of elsewhere entirely theoretical. She could cook in a way that made his kitchen smell like a home instead of an apology. He wasn't going to send her anywhere. "The room's yours," he said, "and Eli's. We'll talk in the morning about terms, but—" He paused. "But you're not going anywhere in this weather, so—" She looked at him for a moment. Her gray-green eyes were tired and careful, and something else underneath it he didn't try to name. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Thank you for the stew." She almost smiled. It was barely there, a slight softening at the corners of her mouth, but he caught it. They finished supper in quiet. From the side room came the soft, even breathing of a sleeping child. Outside, the storm pressed itself against the cabin walls and settled in for the night. Silas washed his bowl in the basin because that was his habit, and he wasn't going to break his habits on account of company. He banked the fire. He checked the door latch. He paused at the hallway to the sleeping room and said, without turning fully around, "If the boy wakes in the night and needs something, don't try to manage alone. The floor between your room and mine has a board that creaks. I'll hear it before you even knock." A brief pause. "All right," she said. He went to his room. He lay down on his bunk with his hands behind his head and listened to the storm and the fire and the distant sound of the baby breathing, and did not, for the first time in a very long time, feel the particular weight of a cabin that held only one person. He didn't examine that feeling. He went to sleep. 2 days the storm held. Then 3. Silas woke each morning before first light, which was his habit, and came out to find the fire already going and Abigail already in the kitchen. She rose before him, which disconcerted him slightly. Not in a bad way, just in the way that anything unfamiliar disconcerts a man who has spent 4 years alone. On the first morning, he stood in the kitchen doorway in his long-sleeved undershirt and suspenders because he hadn't thought to put his jacket on first, and she was standing at the stove with Eli in the crook of her left arm, stirring something with her right hand, and she looked up at him over her shoulder without any particular expression. "There's coffee," she said, "if you'd like it." He got his own coffee. He sat at the table. He did not think about the fact that he was sitting in his own kitchen in his undershirt in front of a woman he barely knew because it was 5 in the morning and the thought had simply not occurred to him until it was too late to do anything about it without making it awkward. She didn't seem to notice or to care. "What do you need from the larder today?" she asked. "Whatever you need," he said. "You're the cook." "I'm asking because I want to know what your priorities are. If you have things you're trying to make last longer than others, I need to know that before I plan." That was practical. He appreciated practical. "The smoked pork needs to last until at least January," he said. "The flour I'd like to stretch to February if possible. Everything else, use as needed." She nodded, filing the information away. "I'll make a list of what we have. May I?" "It's your kitchen," he said, and then stopped, because that wasn't exactly what he'd meant to say. She looked at him briefly. Something moved in her expression. Not quite humor, but in the neighborhood of it. "For now," she said quietly, and turned back to the stove. On the second day of the storm, while Eli napped in the afternoon, she asked him where he kept his mending pile. He pointed at the wooden crate in the corner of the main room, which contained approximately 4 months of socks and shirt cuffs that he'd been meaning to get to. She sat down by the fire with a needle and thread and worked through it with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. He was at the table working on his account books, and for a long stretch of time neither of them spoke, and the fire crackled, and outside the snow came down, and Silas Mercer sat in his own cabin and felt something he couldn't quite identify. He identified it eventually, around the 3rd hour of that afternoon. It took him a while because it was a feeling he hadn't had in long enough that he barely recognized it. It was the feeling of not being alone. He wasn't sure what to do with that. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. He went out to check the animals and clear the snow from the barn door and check the water line from the well. All the things a man had to do after a 3-day blow, and when he came back and stamping snow off his boots, he found Abigail had used the morning to reorganize the entire larder. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. Every shelf was labeled. Every container was organized by type and usage priority. The supplies he'd asked her to make last were on the back shelves, clearly separated from the everyday stores. The dried goods were in proper sealed tins instead of the open paper sacks he'd been using, which let moisture in and ruined things. "Where did you get the tins?" he asked. "They were in the crate in the back corner, empty. I washed them." He had genuinely forgotten those tins existed. He looked at the larder for another moment. Then he looked at her. "It's good," he said, which was not remotely equal to what he was looking at, but it was what came out. "There are gaps," she said matter-of-factly. "You're low on salt. If you have another supply run before the pass closes for the season, salt should be first priority." "I'll remember that." "I wrote it down." She handed him a folded piece of paper. "In case." He took the paper. He looked at it. In small, neat handwriting, she'd listed every gap in the supplies, with notes next to each item about how long the current stores would stretch and what substitutions were available if resupply wasn't possible. He refolded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said. "It's my job," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but you did it well." She looked at him for just a moment, that careful, measuring look she had, and then turned back to the stove. That was the thing about Abigail Foster. Silas was beginning to understand. She accepted a compliment the way she accepted most things, quietly, without deflecting it or making too much of it. She just took it in and went on. He went back outside to check the fence line. By the end of the first week, a shape had emerged to their days that Silas hadn't planned and hadn't expected but found himself settling into without resistance. Mornings were hers first, then his. Evenings, they ate together at the table because the alternative was eating alone in separate rooms in a cabin that wasn't big enough to make separate rooms practical, and that would have been unnecessarily awkward. She didn't try to fill the silence with chatter, which he appreciated. When she had something to say, she said it. Otherwise, she let things be quiet. But the quiet was different now. He'd lived in that cabin alone for 4 years, and the quiet had been the particular pressing kind that large amounts of empty space produce in a man who's stopped expecting anything to break it. This quiet was different. There was Eli in it, small sounds, the occasional determined vocalization of a baby learning that his voice existed, the sound of him pulling himself upright against the edge of the crib, and then thumping back down on the mattress. There was the sound of Abigail moving through the kitchen with calm purpose. There was the smell of food cooking. It was different. Silas noticed it, acknowledged it to himself, and said nothing about it to anyone. On the 8th day, he was coming in from the barn at midday and heard through the kitchen window the sound of Abigail laughing. He stopped walking for a second because the sound was so unexpected. Not because it was unpleasant, the opposite, but because he couldn't recall the last time he'd heard anyone laugh in this cabin, and the sound of it hit him somewhere he hadn't been expecting. He came inside. Eli was on the floor of the kitchen on a blanket, and Abigail was kneeling beside him, making faces. Some ridiculous series of expressions that were apparently the funniest thing Eli had encountered in his 9 months on Earth, because he was laughing in that helpless, whole-body way that infants laugh, throwing his head back and grabbing at her hands. She looked up when Silas came in. She was still smiling, her face open and warm, in a way he hadn't seen from her yet. The careful composure she usually wore was entirely gone, and what was underneath was something entirely different, something lighter. "Sorry," she said, reaching up to push a strand of hair back from her face. "He discovered today that if I make a certain face, he loses his mind completely. We've been at this for 20 minutes. Silas looked at the baby, who was still giggling, and then at Abigail, and felt something shift in his chest that he recognized and immediately filed away somewhere he wasn't going to look at for a while. "Don't apologize," he said. He went to hang up his coat and wash his hands, and by the time he came to the table for the midday meal, she had the careful composure back in place, and Eli was installed in the little chair she'd fashioned for him from a crate and some folded blankets, watching them both with his solemn dark eyes. But Silas had seen what was underneath the composure now. He didn't forget it. One evening, maybe 10 days in, he was repairing a piece of harness at the table, and she was sitting across from him writing in a small notebook, a cooking log, she'd explained, recording what she'd used and what she'd made and what had worked. When he asked, without planning to ask, "Your husband, he was a farmer?" She looked up. "Yes." "Good one?" A pause. "He was better with plans and with follow-through," she said carefully. "The farm looked good on paper." Silas turned the harness in his hands. "What was he like?" Another pause, longer this time. He thought she might not answer. "He was a man who believed his own opinion of himself very strongly," she said finally. "Which is not the same thing as being the person he believed he was." She looked back at her notebook. "He wasn't good to me. I don't mean he was always cruel. He wasn't always anything. He was sometimes very kind and sometimes very hard, and the hardness was the part that lasted." Silas said nothing. "He didn't like—" She stopped, seemed to consider whether to continue. "He didn't like how I looked. He made sure I knew it, often and in detail." She said it flatly, the way someone says a thing they've worn smooth from turning over too many times. "I got careful after a while, about taking up space, about asking for things, about thinking I deserved anything particular." The harness sat still in Silas's hands. "He's the reason you didn't look at those men in town," he said. Not a question. She glanced up. "I looked at them," she said. "I just didn't let them see me do it." He thought about that. "That's different." "Yes," she said. "It is." He went back to the harness. She went back to her notebook. The fire settled. After a while, he said, "For what it's worth, you feed 2 people and manage an infant in a mountain cabin in the middle of winter, and you do it without complaining and without making mistakes. That's not nothing." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet. "Thank you," she said. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its silence, and its extraordinary indifference to the lives being quietly rearranged inside one small, warm cabin on its eastern face. The fire burned. The baby slept. 2 people who had both been very alone sat at a table and were, without either of them saying so, something less alone than they had been before. That was how the first weeks passed on Silas Mercer's mountain. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't uncomplicated. I was a man of rigid habits, and she was a woman still finding her footing in a place she hadn't planned on staying, and there were moments of friction. A wrong word here. A misread silence there. The ordinary difficulty of 2 strangers trying to inhabit the same small space without collision. But underneath the friction was something steadier, something that was, without any announcement or ceremony, beginning to take root. The snow kept falling through November and into December, and the mountain didn't care about anyone's plans. Silas had lived long enough at altitude to know that winter up here wasn't a season so much as a condition, something you adapted to or broke against, with very little middle ground available. He'd watched men come up to the high country full of confidence and leave 2 winters later with something knocked out of them that never quite came back. The mountain had a way of finding the weak place in a person and pressing on it until something gave. What he hadn't expected was to watch it find Abigail Foster and come away empty-handed. She struggled on the steep trails. He watched her. In those first weeks when the snow was still manageable, and they needed to move between the cabin and the barn and the woodpile and the frozen creek, and he could see the effort it cost her. The way her breath came harder on the uphill stretches. The way she had to stop and reset her footing on the icy patches where the ground fell away sharply toward the lower pasture. Her weight made the steep ground harder. That was simply true, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise to himself. But she never stopped. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She would be halfway up the trail from the creek carrying 2 full water buckets, breath coming in hard white clouds, and she would stop for 10 seconds. Just 10, he counted once without meaning to. And then she would pick the buckets back up and finish the climb. Every time. Without complaint, without asking for help she hadn't been offered, without any performance of difficulty designed to make him feel obligated. He started leaving the water buckets at the top of the trail before she got there. Just set them down on the shelf of flat rock near the cabin door so she wouldn't have to carry them up the worst stretch. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it either. But one morning he came around the side of the barn and found her already at the top of the trail with the empty buckets, heading back down for a second trip. And she glanced at him and said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, and went into the barn. She didn't argue with him. He appreciated that. The neighboring trapper, a man named Burl Cotter, who ran a line through the lower forest and stopped at Silas's place every few weeks to warm up and trade information about trail conditions, came by in the second week of November and met Abigail for the first time. Burl was not a malicious man. Silas had known him for 6 years and found him generally decent. But he had the particular blind spot of a man who'd spent most of his life in male company and had never been required to examine the things he said out loud. He came into the cabin stomping snow off his boots, accepted the coffee Abigail set in front of him, looked her up and down with the frank assessment of a man who thought he was being subtle, and said to Silas, "Didn't figure you for hiring a house cook. Thought you'd want someone who could pull their weight on the trail." The cabin went quiet in a particular way. Abigail was at the stove with her back to both of them. She didn't turn around. Silas looked at Burl steadily. "She carries 2 full buckets from the creek twice a day," he said. "In the snow. What are you doing twice a day that I should know about?" Burl blinked. "I didn't mean, and the larder's better organized than it's been in 4 years. We haven't had a bad meal since she got here, and the cabin's warmer because she figured out the draft problem in the chimney that I'd been fighting for 2 winters. Silas set down his own coffee cup. "So," Burl had the grace to look uncomfortable. He turned toward Abigail. "Ma'am, I didn't intend offense." She turned from the stove and looked at him with those steady gray-green eyes. "None taken," she said, in a tone that made it perfectly clear that some had been, but that she had made her own decision about whether to spend energy on it. She refilled Burl's coffee and went back to work. After Burl left, Silas was pulling on his coat to go check the fence line when he heard her very quietly let out a long breath in the kitchen. Just one breath. The kind that a person lets out when they've been holding something in and finally have the room to release it. He stopped with his coat half on. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't land," he said, toward the kitchen doorway. A pause. "I know how to manage it," she said. Not defensive, just stating a fact. "I know you do," he said. "I watched you manage it. I'm saying you don't have to." Another pause, longer. "Some things you get used to," she said finally, "whether you want to or not." He thought about Thomas Foster, the man who'd made sure she knew his opinion of her body, often and in detail. He thought about the men outside the Dunbar trading post. He thought about Burl Cotter, decent enough man, not even trying to wound her, and wounding her anyway without noticing. "That doesn't make it right," Silas said. She didn't answer that. He finished putting on his coat and went outside. The cold hit him in the face and he stood for a moment in the yard, looking out at the snow-covered pasture and the dark line of the tree line beyond, and he felt something that was very close to anger but quieter than anger, more like the thing anger becomes when it doesn't have a clear target. He went to check the fence. December arrived the way it always did at altitude, with a drop in temperature so abrupt it felt personal. The thermometer outside the kitchen window hit 15 below the first week of the month and stayed there for 4 days. And during those 4 days, the world outside the cabin was not a place where a person could afford to make mistakes. The animals needed tending twice a day, no matter the temperature, and that meant Silas going out in it and coming back in with ice in his beard and his hands so cold that the first few minutes back inside produced a particular kind of painful tingling that he'd been experiencing every winter for 12 years and still hadn't gotten used to. Abigail noticed the hands. On the third day, without saying anything about it, she had a basin of warm water waiting for him when he came in. Not hot, because hot on badly cold hands was its own kind of pain, but warm, the right temperature, and she'd added something to it, some dried herb from her supplies, that eased the transition. He sat at the table with his hands in the basin and looked at her across the room. "Calendula," she said before he asked. "My mother used to do it. It helps with the chilblain." He looked at his hands in the water. "Thank you." "Don't leave the animals for longer than necessary tomorrow," she said, in the tone of someone who is saying a practical thing and not a personal thing, even though it was slightly both. The cold at that level starts affecting judgment before you realize it's doing it. I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He looked up at her. She was at the counter kneading bread dough, her back mostly to him, and she said it without turning around. And something about that, the straightforward care of it, the fact that she said it because it was true and not because she was trying to establish something, landed in him in a way he had to look away from. Eli, in his crib in the corner of the kitchen where Abigail kept him during the days so she could watch him while she worked, was pulling himself to standing against the crib rail with enormous concentration. His whole small face contracted with effort. He made it upright, let out a triumphant sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a shout, and then immediately lost his balance and sat back down hard on the mattress. Silas laughed. It came out before he'd planned it, and it was a real laugh, not a polite one. Abigail turned from the dough and looked at Eli, who had already pulled himself back up and was going for it again with the exact same expression of absolute determination. "He's been trying for a week," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it. Warmth, and something tired underneath the warmth, and something proud underneath that. "He'll get it," Silas said. "He will," she agreed. "He's stubborn. He gets it from me." She said it simply, like she was reporting a fact about the weather, and Silas found himself smiling at the bread dough on the counter because she wasn't looking. The days had started developing a rhythm that went beyond practical. They worked in proximity to each other more than he'd expected, not because of any design, but because a mountain ranch in deep winter doesn't offer much separation of spheres. He was in and out of the cabin all day, and she was always there, and they had gotten past the initial careful formality of two strangers and arrived at something that was harder to name. Not friendship exactly. Not yet. More like the particular ease that develops between two people who have decided, without discussing it, to trust each other with the ordinary weight of daily life. He told her things he hadn't planned to tell her. Not important things. Not anything about his history or his feelings or the things he kept stored in the parts of himself he didn't examine, but the small operational details of the ranch that he'd been carrying alone for 4 years. Where the well line was most likely to freeze and how to clear it if it did. Which section of the south fence the elk came through in heavy snow and needed to be reinforced. The particular warning sounds the barn roof made before a really heavy snow load, and when those sounds meant it was time to get up there with a shovel. She listened with genuine attention. She asked practical questions. She remembered everything he told her, and he discovered this because later, when something he'd mentioned came up, she already knew what to do. He wasn't used to that. Being remembered. The incident with the frozen well happened on a Wednesday in the second week of December, and it was the first real test of what they were actually building on that mountain, though neither of them framed it that way. I was in the north pasture checking on the cattle when it happened. She came out onto the porch and called for him with a voice that was controlled but urgent, and he read the urgency in the way she was standing before he could even make out her words. He came back at a jog. "Waterline's not running," she said when he reached the porch. "I turned the handle and nothing came." "How long since you tried it?" 20 minutes ago it was fine. I went back just now and it stopped." He went to the well house, checked the line, and found exactly what he'd feared. The intake pipe had frozen at the elbow joint, the weak spot he'd told her about. He'd packed it with straw at the start of the season, but the cold snap had gone below what the straw could handle. "I need the fire brick," he said, "the small one, in the barn on the left shelf. And bring the old blanket that's on the peg by the barn door." She was already moving. She came back with both items before he'd gotten the well house door fully open, and she crouched down beside him in the cramped space without being asked, holding the fire brick close to the frozen joint while he worked the insulating blanket around the pipe above it. It was tight quarters and cold, and the work required patience, and she provided the patience without complaint, holding the brick steady at the precise angle he needed for 20 minutes while he manipulated the pipe. When the water started running again, a thin trickle at first and then normal flow, she let out a breath and sat back on her heels. "That was the elbow joint," she said. "Yes." "You said in heavy cold it was the weak spot." "I did." She looked at the pipe arrangement. "What if we wrap this joint in copper, not just straw? It would hold the heat better." He looked at the joint, looked at her. "I've got copper sheet in the barn," he said, "from when I did the roof repair. It might take an hour to shape it right." "Probably," he said, "but it'd be worth the hour." They did it that afternoon, the two of them in the cramped well house with the small work lantern between them, cutting and shaping the copper into a sleeve for the vulnerable joint. It was fiddly work that required two sets of hands, and they were close together in the small space. And at one point she reached past him to hold a piece steady, and her arm pressed against his briefly, and neither of them mentioned it, but both of them noticed it. And the noticing was something Silas filed away in the part of himself he was still not ready to examine. The copper sleeve worked. The joint didn't freeze again all winter. But what Silas remembered afterward, when he thought about that afternoon, wasn't the repair. It was the way she'd looked at a problem and seen through to the solution before he had, and offered it without making a production of it, and then rolled up her sleeves and done the work. 3 days before Christmas. Not that Silas generally observed Christmas with any ceremony, but the date was noted. A rider came up the mountain trail. Not from town. From the east, which meant from the Caldwell direction, which meant a longer journey and a reason for it. The rider was a young man Silas didn't know, maybe 20 years old, with a red nose and a hired horse look about him. Someone who'd rented a mount for a specific errand rather than a man at home on horseback. He stopped at the cabin gate and called out, and Silas came to the door. "I'm looking for an Abigail Foster," the young man said. "Got word she was at this location." Silas felt something tighten in his chest that he immediately identified as protective instinct, and then spent a moment questioning why he felt it before deciding to deal with it later. "Who's asking?" "Name's Renfrew. I work for a solicitor's office in Caldwell. We have correspondence for Mrs. Foster regarding the estate of her late husband." From inside the cabin, he heard Abigail's footsteps, and then she appeared in the doorway beside him. She'd heard. Her face was carefully neutral. "I'm Abigail Foster," she said. The young man reached into his coat and produced an envelope, leaning down from his horse to hand it over. "Solicitor Haynes says you'll want to respond at your earliest convenience, ma'am. There's a matter of a debt claim against the Foster estate that's been filed with the county court. Someone's contesting the settlement." She took the envelope. Her hand was steady. "Who?" she asked. "A man named Carl Breck says he held a note from your husband." Something changed in her face at that name. Very small. A tightening around the eyes that wasn't quite fear but was something adjacent to it. The look of someone hearing a name they'd hoped not to hear again. "Thank you," she said to the rider. "Tell Mr. Haynes I'll respond." The rider nodded and turned his horse. Silas watched him go, then looked at Abigail. She was staring at the envelope. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. She sat at the table and turned the envelope over in her hands without opening it for a moment. Eli was on his blanket near the stove, occupied with a wooden spoon he'd claimed as his preferred object, watching her with his usual solemn attention. "Who is Carl Breck?" Silas asked. She looked up at him. "A man Thomas borrowed money from. 2 years ago, when the first season on the farm went badly." She paused. "Thomas said it was a gentleman's arrangement, a favor between neighbors. No formal note, no interest discussed." She looked back at the envelope. "Thomas told me the debt was settled before he died. He said he'd handled it. But Thomas said a great many things. She said it without bitterness, just fact. He believed them when he said them. Whether they were true was a separate matter. Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. How much? She opened the envelope then, unfolded the letter inside and read it. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her shoulders settled differently. $240, she said, plus interest going back 22 months. He's claiming Thomas signed a note. $240 was not a small sum. For a woman with a 9-month-old and one travel bag, arriving at a mountain ranch with nothing but her labor to offer, it was an enormous sum. Did Thomas mention a note? He asked. No, he mentioned a favor. She set the letter on the table. Which could mean there was no note and Breck is lying. Or it could mean Thomas didn't tell me the full truth of it. A pause. The second is more likely. Silas looked at the letter. You need to respond to the solicitor. Find out what documentation Breck is presenting. I know. She folded the letter back along its creases. I'm sorry. This isn't your... She stopped. This is my problem, not yours. You're living on my ranch in the middle of December with the pass closed, he said. Makes it practical for me to know about. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression. She was trying to read whether he meant something beyond what he'd said, and he wasn't entirely sure himself what he meant beyond what he'd said, so he held her gaze and kept his face even. I'll write to Mr. Haynes tomorrow, she said. There's nothing to be done before the pass opens anyway. Write tonight, he said, while it's fresh. I'll take it down to Gerald when the road's passable and have him send it on. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she nodded. All right, she said. He got up to make coffee because it was the kind of news that sat better with something warm in your hands. And she sat at the table behind him, and he could feel the weight of what she was carrying, the debt and the dead husband and the baby on the floor and the mountain outside and the long winter ahead. And he didn't turn around because if he turned around, he wasn't sure what expression would be on his face. He handed her the coffee over his shoulder. She took it. He's going to try to take what little I have, she said quietly. Maybe, Silas said. He sat back down. But you haven't given him what he wants yet. And until you do, it's a letter from a solicitor. Nothing more. She looked at him over the coffee cup. You're very calm about other people's problems. I've had a lot of practice being calm, he said. Most things that look terrible at first don't end up being exactly as terrible as they first look. Some of them do, but not most. That's not as comforting as you might think, she said. No, he agreed, but it's honest. She almost smiled. There it was again. That slight softening that appeared and disappeared so quickly, he sometimes wondered if he'd imagined it. She wrote the letter that evening after Eli was asleep, at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, writing in her small, neat hand. Silas sat across from her working on a harness repair, not bothering her, just present, and twice she asked him a question about legal terminology that he didn't fully know the answer to, and both times they worked it out together. And by the end of the evening, the letter was done and sealed and propped against the lamp to wait for the road to open. She sat back in her chair and rolled her neck, and he heard something crack. Get some sleep, he said. I was thinking, she said, not moving yet, about Breck. Thomas borrowed from him the year before Eli was born. I was already pregnant when he told me about the debt, buried in the middle of other news, like he hoped I wouldn't notice it. She was quiet for a moment. He knew I'd worry. He didn't like when I worried. He said it made me look... She stopped. Silas waited. Anyway, she said, I've been wondering how much I didn't know. About the finances, about the farm, about what Thomas told people versus what was true. She rubbed the side of her face. That's a very uncomfortable thing to wonder. Yes, he said. You're not going to tell me it's all right? You didn't ask me to. She looked at him, that long, steady look. No, she said. I didn't. She stood up. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Good night, he said. He sat at the table after she'd gone to her room, and he looked at the sealed letter against the lamp. And he thought about a man who had made this woman believe for years that her own face was a problem he had to live with. He thought about what that did to a person. Not the dramatic wounds, but the quiet, sustained ones, the kind that didn't bleed visibly, but hollowed things out over years. He thought about the way she'd said it, without seeking his pity, without drama. Just this happened, and here I am on the other side of it. He banked the fire and went to bed. January came and settled over the mountain like something that had decided to stay. The cold acquired a permanence that February would eventually disprove, but which in the middle of January felt entirely convincing. Silas added a second nightly check on the barn because the cattle were his livelihood, and the cold at -20 was the kind that could kill a weakened animal overnight. He went out at 10 each night before bed, and again at 4 each morning before sunrise, and it was on one of these 10 o'clock checks in the second week of January that he came back to find Abigail still at the kitchen table. This was unusual. She went to bed early because Eli woke early, and she was always up before Silas, and he'd gotten used to the cabin being dark and quiet when he came in from the late barn check. She was sitting in the lamplight with her hands flat on the table, not writing, not sewing, not doing anything, just sitting. He came in and stamped the snow from his boots and said, "Something wrong with Eli?" "He's fine. He's asleep." She looked up. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't crying, but they had the look of someone who'd been thinking hard enough that emotion had burned itself out. "I couldn't sleep." He hung up his coat. He went to the stove and checked the kettle, which was still warm enough, and poured 2 cups of tea without asking. He set one in front of her and sat down. "Breck," he said. It wasn't really a question. The letter had gone down with Gerald 2 weeks prior, and they'd had no response yet, which was about right for the timeline given the winter road conditions. But the waiting had a weight to it that neither of them discussed, and both of them felt. "I keep trying to work out if there's anything I can do," she said. "From here, in winter." Which there isn't. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I don't do well with waiting." "No." "You've noticed. You're a person who does things," he said. "Waiting is hard for people like that." She looked at him. "What kind of person are you?" He thought about it. "Same, probably, but I've had more practice finding things to do on a mountain in January. Like going to check cattle at 10 at night in -20. The cattle don't care what time it is." She almost laughed. Just that sound that was the beginning of a laugh, short and surprised. "I'm scared," she said then, straightforwardly. "If Breck makes his claim stick, I don't have anything to pay it with. The law would go looking, and all I have is my wages from here, and it's not close to $240. She said it without self-pity, just reporting the landscape. "I would have to leave. Find something else. Somewhere else. Cheaper. Something that lets me keep Eli." She paused. I'd started to feel like I was building something. Here. Even if it's temporary. I'd started to feel less like I was falling." The kitchen was very quiet. Silas turned his teacup on the table once, a habit he had when he was thinking. "We don't know yet that he can make it stick," he said. "You said yourself Thomas told you the debt was settled. If there's no documentation, Thomas's word against Breck's, and Thomas is dead." She shook her head. "I don't know how a court reads that." "The solicitor will know. Wait for his response." "I know." She looked at her tea. "I know. I'm just sitting here at 10 at night making it worse in my head, which is what you do when you can't sleep and you're scared." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had shown up on a frozen supply wagon and not looked at the men who mocked her, who had reorganized his larder and fixed his chimney draft, and insulated his water line and made his kitchen smell like a home, who was sitting up alone at 10 at night being frightened with the same quiet practicality she brought to everything else. "Abigail," he said. He didn't often use her first name. He watched her eyes come up when he said it. "The ranch is doing all right," he said. "I'm not a rich man and I'm not going to pretend I am. But if it comes to needing funds to fight a legal claim, there are options. I'm not going to let a debt collector take you off this mountain on the basis of a dead man's word against a stranger's." She stared at him. She stopped. Started again. "That's a very large thing to say." "I know what I said." "Why?" Not suspicious, genuinely asking. He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you've earned it," he said. 4 months ago I had a cabin that was cold and a kitchen that was an embarrassment, and I was burning the same 3 things over and over and calling it eating. Now I have a larder that's organized for the first time in years, and a water line that works, and I come in at night to something that smells like a home." He paused. "And because you're a decent person being chased by a dead man's debts, and that's not right." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very clear. "I'm not going to let you do that," she said. Not unless I can find a way to pay it back eventually." We'll figure that out if it comes to it, he said. It hasn't come to it yet. She held his gaze for another moment, then looked down at her tea. Thank you, she said. Outside, the mountain night was absolute. No wind, just cold and darkness, and the weight of all that snow on the trees and the ground and the barn roof and the frozen creek. Inside, 2 lamps burned on the table and the fire was low but present. Go to bed, he said. Eli's going to be up in 4 hours no matter what you decide to do tonight. She made a sound that was more or less a laugh. Yes. She stood, pushed her chair back, picked up her cup. Silas? He looked up. I'm glad the wagon stopped here, she said. She said it simply and directly, the way she said most things, and then she went to her room. He sat alone at this table for a while with his hands around his cooling cup of tea, and outside the mountain held everything in its cold, dark silence. And he thought that whatever this winter was making out of the 2 of them, in this cabin, in these weeks of proximity and shared work and shared difficulty, whatever it was not nothing. It was, in fact, something he had not expected and could not easily name. He sat with that for a while. Then he banked the fire and went to bed. The solicitor's response arrived on the first day of February, carried up the mountain by Gerald Pratt's nephew, who made the supply run when the road was briefly passable between storms. Silas brought the letter inside and set it on the table without comment, and Abigail dried her hands on her apron and picked it up and read it standing at the kitchen counter. He watched her face while she read. She had the kind of face that didn't give much away when she was working to control it, but he'd been watching that face for 3 months now, and he knew the small tells. The slight tension around her jaw, the way her eyes moved more slowly when the words were difficult. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the counter and stood with her hand flat on top of it. He has a note, she said, signed by Thomas, dated 14 months before Thomas died. Silas came to the table and sat down. Legitimate? The solicitor thinks it appears so. The signature matches Thomas's records at the county land office. She paused. $240 at 8% annual interest. 18 months outstanding. She did the arithmetic in her head the way she did everything, fast and without fuss. That's $273 and some change that Breck is claiming. And Thomas told you the debt was settled. Thomas told me a lot of things. She said it without inflection, but he heard what was underneath it. Not anger at Thomas exactly, because Thomas was dead, and anger at the dead was a particular kind of exhausting that she'd apparently decided wasn't worth her energy, more like the weary recognition of a pattern that had defined years of her life. What does the solicitor recommend? Silas asked. He says I have 2 choices. Contest the claim on the basis that Thomas assured me it was settled, which would require going to county court in Caldwell, which would require traveling to Caldwell, which... She stopped. Outside the window, the snow was coming down again. Which isn't possible until spring at the earliest. Or I can attempt a negotiated settlement, offer Breck a portion now, and arrange payment for the remainder over time. Can you negotiate from here? The solicitor can act as intermediary. She finally turned from the counter and sat down across from him. She looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. The deep kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. Silas, I need to tell you something. He waited. I looked through Thomas's papers before I left the farm, after he died. I was looking for the deed, for account records, trying to understand what we had and what we owed. She folded her hands on the table. I found a letter from Breck, from 8 months before Thomas died. In it, Breck is asking about the note, asking when Thomas intends to begin repayment. Thomas had written a reply, a draft of 1, never sent, I don't think, saying he needed more time, that the farm was going to turn around. She paused. I didn't think much of it then. There were so many letters like that. Thomas was always telling someone the farm was going to turn around. You still have the letter? She looked at him. I brought the papers with me, all of them. I didn't know what was important and what wasn't, so I brought everything. She paused. Silas, the letter from Breck. In it, he mentions the terms of the note, 8%. But it also says something else. It says, and I remember this, it says that Thomas had made 2 payments against the principal. In the first year, $50 each. Silas went still. So Thomas paid $100 against a $240 debt, he said slowly. That's what the letter implies, which Breck's current claim does not account for. They looked at each other across the table. "Where are the papers?" he asked. "In my travel bag. In the room." "Get them." She got them. They spread Thomas Foster's papers across the kitchen table. A disorganized accumulation of farm records, receipts, correspondence, land documents, and went through them together, Abigail reading and sorting, Silas holding the lamp where the light was needed. Eli, awake from his afternoon nap, sat in his blanket crate and watched them with the focused attention of a child who understood something important was happening, even if the specifics were beyond him. They found 3 things that mattered: the letter from Breck referencing Thomas's 2 prior payments, a handwritten receipt, Thomas's handwriting, not Breck's, noting payment to C. Breck, $50, June, with a year marked, and a second notation in the back of Thomas's farm ledger, the same amount, the same recipient, 11 months later. "He kept records of the payments," Abigail said. She was holding the ledger page close to the lamp, her voice careful and controlled. "He just didn't tell me about them, or about the remaining debt." "The man kept secrets instead of having conversations," Silas said. "Yes." She set the ledger down. "But in this case, the secrets might save me." She looked at the 3 documents. "If I send these to the solicitor, if Breck's claim doesn't account for the $100 already paid, then his figure is wrong, and a wrong figure weakens a claim considerably. It doesn't erase the remaining debt. No, but it changes the negotiation." Something had come back into her eyes. Not relief exactly, but the particular sharp focus of a person who has found a foothold on ground they thought was smooth. $140 is manageable, especially over time. "It's still money you don't have." "It's money I can earn," she said, "given time." He looked at her. "You're already earning wages here." She met his eyes. "I know," she said. I'm not asking you to." "I know what you're not asking," he said. "I'm stating a fact. By spring, you'll have 4 months of wages. That's a start." She looked at the papers on the table for a moment. Then she nodded once, briskly, the way she nodded when she'd made a decision and was done second-guessing it. "I'll write to the solicitor tonight," she said. "Send the copies with Gerald as soon as the road allows." "Good." She started gathering the papers into order. Her hands were steady. He watched her work and thought about Thomas Foster, a man he'd never met and had no particular interest in, who had borrowed money and kept it secret and paid some of it back and kept that secret too, and had apparently spent his marriage treating his wife's body like a problem and her intelligence like a threat, and had died leaving her to clean up the wreckage with a 9-month-old on her hip. Silas Mercer was not a man who wasted energy on the dead, but he thought, not for the first time, that Thomas Foster had been a particular kind of fool. 3 days later, the temperature dropped to the lowest point of the winter. Silas's thermometer read 22 below when he went out for the morning barn check on the 14th of February, and the air had the particular crystalline stillness that extreme cold produced, every breath coming out in a cloud that hung briefly before the cold collapsed it. He got the animals tended as fast as he safely could and came back inside, and the contrast between outside and inside, the heat of the cabin, the smell of breakfast, the sound of Eli making his morning sounds from the side room, hit him harder than usual, maybe because the cold outside had been so absolute. Abigail was at the stove. She looked at him over her shoulder when he came in. "How bad?" she asked. "Very." He got his coat off, started working the feeling back into his hands. "Going to be like this for a few days, I think." "The cattle?" "Managed. I'll check again at noon." He sat down and she brought coffee without being asked, and he noticed that she'd already added the slight amount of sugar he took, which she'd noticed he preferred sometime in the past month without him ever having mentioned it. He wrapped his hands around the cup and said nothing, and she went back to the stove. That was the morning Eli stood up. Not against the crib rail this time. Abigail had come out of the side room carrying him and set him on the kitchen floor on his blanket while she finished breakfast, and he'd been pulling himself to standing against the leg of the kitchen chair, which he'd been doing for 2 weeks. But this time, when he got upright, he let go. He stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, completely unsupported, looking profoundly surprised at himself. Then he sat down. Abigail had her back to him. Silas was watching from the table. "He just stood," Silas said. She spun around. Eli was already back on the floor, patting the blanket with both hands like he was checking it was still there. "He let go of the chair," she said. "For about 4 seconds. She stared at her son. Something crossed her face that Silas didn't try to describe. It was the kind of expression that belonged entirely to her and to this moment, and not to any observer. "Do it again," she told Eli, in the tone of someone who knows perfectly well that a 10-month-old cannot take direction but says it anyway. Eli looked at her with great seriousness and grabbed the chair leg again and pulled himself up. "Come on," she said. "Let go." He let go. 5 seconds this time before he tipped sideways and caught himself on one hand. Abigail made a sound, something between a laugh and a sharp breath, and crossed the kitchen and crouched down beside him and grabbed his face in both hands and said, "There you are. There you are, Eli." Silas watched her hold her son's face and felt, with perfect clarity, that he was looking at something private and fundamental. The specific love of a mother for a child she had carried alone through grief and hardship and uncertainty, finding its expression in a kitchen in a mountain cabin in the middle of the coldest February on record. He looked away, picked up his coffee cup, gave them the moment. The night it happened was the 19th of February. Silas knew the date afterward because he'd written it down in the ranch log, the way he wrote down everything that mattered. Not from sentiment, but from the same practical record-keeping instinct that made him note the first frost date and the cattle weights and the supply inventory. February 19th. The coldest night of the year. He woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of Abigail's voice. Not a call for help. Not that kind of urgency. Not yet. Just her voice through the wall between their rooms, low and tight. The particular tone of someone trying very hard to stay calm. He was up before he was fully awake, moving on reflex through the hallway and to the door of her room without stopping to think about it. She was at the crib. The lamp was lit. She had Eli against her shoulder and she was rocking, not the easy rocking of putting a child to sleep, but the tight, contained rocking of someone holding themselves together by concentration. "He's burning," she said, when Silas appeared in the doorway. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way that voices get when fear has been pushed down so hard it comes out sounding almost like calm. "He was fussy when I put him down. I thought it was teeth. I came to check just now, and he's... Feel him." Silas crossed the room and put the back of his hand to Eli's forehead. The child was radiating heat in a way that was immediately, obviously wrong. Not the mild warmth of teething, not the slight fever. This was something with intent to it. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know. He was warm when I put him down, but I thought..." She stopped. "Maybe 3 hours. Maybe more." "Is he responsive?" She pulled Eli back slightly to look at his face, and Silas looked too. The baby's eyes were open but glassy, not focused, not tracking the lamp the way his eyes normally tracked any light source with sharp infant interest. His breath was fast and shallow. "Eli." Abigail said his name. Nothing. "Eli." She touched his cheek. The baby turned his head slightly toward the touch, but slowly. Too slowly. "All right," Silas said. He said it the way he said things when he was operating on pure practicality, with the feeling set aside, which was the only useful way to operate in a moment like this. "Come into the kitchen. Bring him. I need you to tell me exactly what you know about fever in infants." She came into the kitchen. He got the fire built up fast and high. She sat in the chair nearest the stove with Eli against her chest, one hand on his back, feeling the too fast rise and fall of his breathing. "He needs to come down," she said. "The fever. If it goes too high, it's..." She stopped. "Cool cloths. Lukewarm water, not cold. And there are things... I have a tin in the top shelf of the larder, dried elderflower. My mother used it. I don't know if it works, I don't know what..." Her voice cracked, just once, and she brought it back. "I don't know enough. Silas, I don't know enough." "You know more than I do," he said. "What else? What medicinal supplies do you have?" "The elderflower. Some dried yarrow. I got it from May Dunbar when I saw it in the store. I didn't know why I wanted it. I just..." She was rocking again, that tight, controlled rock. "Yarrow can break a fever. I've seen it used. It needs to be made into a weak tea and given in small amounts." "Do you have it?" "Yes. In the same tin." He was already at the larder. He found the tin. She'd labeled everything, of course she had, and brought it to her, and she told him the amounts, and he made the tea while she held the baby, and the making of it was something to do with his hands. which was good because the alternative was standing there watching an infant struggle to breathe, and that was not something a person could do without losing something. "We need the fever lower," she said. "The cloths. Lukewarm." He prepared the cloths. She applied them, gently, to Eli's forehead, the back of his neck, his wrists. The baby fussed weakly at the contact, which was, paradoxically, better than no response at all, and both of them registered this without saying it. "There are roots," Silas said. She looked up at him. "North face of the ridge, below the second outcropping. There's a stand of what I always thought was just mountain plant, but I've seen the Cotter family use the roots for fever medicines. Burl's wife mentioned it last spring when their youngest was sick." He paused. "I don't know if it's what you'd use. I don't know the name of it." "Describe the plant." He described it. She listened with intense focus. "It might be boneset," she said slowly. "If it grows in clusters, hollow stems, rough leaves. Yes. Boneset root. For fever." She looked at him. "Where exactly?" "Under the second shelf on the north face. 30-minute walk in good conditions. Tonight—" He stopped. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing at the cabin walls, and the temperature at 2 in the morning on February 19th was sitting at 20 below. "Don't," she said. She'd read his thought before he'd finished having it. "The path is protected on the north side by the tree line. The worst exposed stretch is maybe 5 minutes. Silas, if Burl Cotter's wife used it for fever and it worked, you don't even know if it's the same plant." She was looking at him with something that was beyond argument, something stark and frightened and absolutely direct. I won't have you freeze on that ridge for something that might not help." "And if we don't try," he said quietly, "and it gets worse." Neither of them finished that sentence. They both knew what was at the end of it. Eli made a small sound, not crying, just a thin, weak sound that infants make when they're past the energy for crying, and Abigail's arms tightened around him and she bowed her head over his briefly, and Silas saw her lips move without sound. "Stay with him," Silas said. "Keep the cloths changed. Give him the yarrow tea in small amounts. Just drops. Don't try to make him drink." He was already moving toward his coat. "I'll be back in under an hour." "Silas?" Her voice stopped him at the door. He turned. She was looking at him with everything visible in her face, the fear for Eli, the fear for him, the helplessness of a woman who was used to acting and had no action available to her in this moment, all of it right there on the surface. "Be careful," she said. It was the most stripped-down thing she'd said to him in 4 months. No practical frame around it, nothing to deflect the directness of it. "I will," he said. He went out. The cold was a living thing at that hour. It hit him in the face and went straight through the first 2 layers of clothing until he pulled the wool scarf up over his lower face and tucked his chin down. He moved fast, not running, which would have been dangerous in the dark on icy ground, but the fastest controlled pace he could maintain with a lantern in one hand and his knowledge of the trail in the other. The path to the North Ridge was one. He'd walked hundreds of times in daylight and a fair number of times in dark, but not often at this temperature, and not with this particular weight behind every step. He kept his mind on the practical, where the trail footing was reliable, where the ice would be worst, where the protected section through the trees began and where it ended. He did not think about Eli's glassy, unfocused eyes. He did not think about the sound the baby had made. He thought about plant identification. He thought about Burl Cotter's wife saying the roots were good for breaking fever, the way she'd said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd used a thing and seen it work. He thought about the stand of plants below the second outcropping, the cluster of dry winter stalks that would be brittle and snow-covered now, but the roots would be in the ground, alive and viable. He found the outcropping by landmarks in the dark, a particular angle of the ridgeline, a leaning pine he'd used as a marker for years. He crouched in the snow and cleared the surface growth with his gloved hands, exposing frozen ground, and dug with the short-handled knife he'd brought, working the ground loose in the way you worked ground that didn't want to be worked. His hands were losing feeling by the time he found the roots. Thick, fibrous, the kind of roots that went deep and held. He cut sections of them, packed them into the cloth bag, and stood up. His back protested. His hands had crossed from painful cold into the numb zone that required attention. The walk back was harder. The wind had shifted and was now coming across the open stretch of the trail in a way it hadn't been on the way out. He put his head down and moved. When he came through the cabin door 43 minutes after he'd left, he was coated in ice from the waist up where the wind had driven the snow into the wool, and his hands were bad enough that he couldn't properly close them. Abigail looked up from the chair by the stove where she was sitting with Eli. Her face registered his state in an instant. "Sit down," she said. "The roots? In the bag." He managed to hold it out, and she took it, and then she looked at his hands. "Basin," she said immediately. "Warm water, same as always." "Eli first." "I'll do both at the same time. Sit down." He sat down. He put his hands in the basin she'd already prepared. She'd had it ready, he realized. She'd had it waiting. And the transition back to warmth was the specific agony it always was, 10 times worse than usual. And he sat with his jaw tight and his hands in the water while she worked at the small stove, cleaning the roots, cutting them, putting them into a pot of water over the lowest heat, all while keeping Eli propped against her shoulder with one arm. She moved through it with a kind of furious competence. Not graceful, not smooth, just effective, just relentless, because the alternative was falling apart, and she was not going to fall apart. The root tea took 20 minutes to steep to the concentration she wanted. She strained it and added water from the cold kettle to bring it to the right temperature. And she sat down with Eli and she gave it to him in drops from a spoon, just drops, just the smallest amounts. And she talked to him the whole time in a low voice that Silas could hear from where he sat across the room. She didn't say anything in particular. She said his name. She told him she was there. She told him about the morning, what she'd make for breakfast when morning came, what they'd do that day. She didn't say it would be fine. Silas noticed that. She didn't promise him anything she couldn't deliver. She just kept talking, keeping her voice going, as if the sound of it was something he could hold on to. By 4 in the morning, Eli's breathing had changed, still fast but less labored. He'd taken more of the tea than Silas had expected, the body's instinct for what it needed apparently still functional, even at this level of fever. By 5, Abigail looked up from the baby with eyes that were exhausted and frightened and something that might have been cautiously, tentatively hopeful. "He's cooler," she said. "Not much, but a little." Silas, who had not slept, was sitting in the chair across from her. His hands had come back fully, which had taken an hour. He looked at Eli's face. "His color's better," he said. It was true. The hectic flush had toned down slightly. "It might not last," she said. "The fever might come back up. We have to watch him." "I know." She changed the cloths again, applied them with the automatic care of someone whose hands had memorized the task. She looked at Silas. "Go lie down for a few hours," she said. "I'll call you if it changes." "I'm not going anywhere." "Silas, I'm not going anywhere," he said again, with a quiet that settled the question. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. They stayed through what was left of the night, taking turns with the cloths and the tea, swapping without being asked, working in the particular wordless coordination of two people who have become accustomed to sharing work in a shared space. At one point, she dozed in the chair with Eli against her chest, and Silas sat across from them and kept watch and did not look away. Dawn came at around 6:30. The light changed in the kitchen window from black to gray to the pale flat light of a winter morning, and Eli, who had been fitfully dozing, opened his eyes. He looked at Abigail. Then he looked at Silas. Then he made a sound, small, inquiring, the sound he made in ordinary mornings when he woke up and was taking inventory of his world. Abigail looked down at her son and put her hand to his forehead. She stayed very still for a moment. Then something in her entire body changed. The held quality she'd had all night, the tightly maintained control, released all at once, silently. She pressed her lips together and closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were wet. "He's down," she said. "The fever's down." Silas let out a breath. She held Eli tighter, and he made a protesting sound because she was squeezing him, and she loosened her grip and laughed. A short, broken sound that had nothing composed about it. And he patted her face with his small hand with the dreamy imprecision of a baby who isn't entirely sure where faces begin and end. Silas stood up from his chair. His back was extremely unhappy about the night he'd spent in it. He went to the stove and built up the fire and put the kettle on, and he stood at the stove with his back to the room for a moment, because he needed a moment to be somewhere other people couldn't see his face. When he turned around, she was watching him. Eli was against her shoulder, calm now, making small sounds. Her eyes were still wet. "The roots," she said. "It was the roots." "Maybe," he said, "or the yarrow, or the cloths, or all of it." "You went out in that cold. The important thing is that he's down," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Silas." She said his name the way she'd said it at the cabin door the night before, stripped of the practical frame, just his name. "I didn't ask you to do that. Go out in that." "No," he said. "You didn't." "Why did you?" He turned back to the kettle, which didn't need tending, and then turned back around because pretending to tend the kettle was the kind of thing he found embarrassing in himself when he noticed it. "Because He stopped, thought about what he was going to say. "He's not hired help to me. He's not your employment contract. He's Eli." He said the name the way the baby's name had come to feel in his mouth over 4 months, like a fact about his own life. "He's been in this cabin every day since October, and I've watched him learn to stand up and try to put a wooden spoon in his ear and pull every folded blanket off every surface he can reach." He paused. "I wasn't going to sit in a warm cabin while there was something I might be able to do." Abigail looked at him with those steady gray-green eyes. Everything she was feeling was visible in them, which was unusual for her. She was a person who kept her face managed usually, and right now she wasn't managing it at all. "Thank you," she said. And then, quietly, "He doesn't have a father. He's never had a father. But this morning—" She stopped. The sentence didn't finish. She looked away, out at the window where the winter morning was arriving pale and cold and complete. Silas didn't answer it. He poured the tea and brought her a cup and looked at Eli, who had closed his eyes again and was breathing with the slow, even regularity of real sleep rather than the fast, shallow breathing of fever. They sat in the kitchen in the early morning light, the three of them, and outside the mountain was still and cold and absolutely indifferent, and inside the fire burned and the tea was hot, and the baby slept on his mother's chest. Later, much later, when Eli was in his crib and genuinely, deeply sleeping, and Abigail had finally agreed to lie down for a few hours, Silas sat alone at the kitchen table. He was tired in his bones. His hands still ached slightly where the cold had been worst. He thought about what she hadn't finished saying. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the kitchen doorway before he'd gone out, all the composure gone. He thought about the words she'd almost said but stopped before she got there. He didn't go back to sleep. He sat at the table while the winter morning brightened outside and thought about the people who had come to occupy his cabin and his days and whatever it was that had quietly rearranged itself inside him over 4 months of cold and work and firelight and shared tables. He had not expected any of this. That thought arrived in him without judgment, without calculation, just as a fact about his own life that he was going to have to decide what to do with, one of these days, when the mountain let the season turn and the world outside the cabin became something other than survival. One of these days. But not yet. Eli recovered slowly, the way babies do. Not in a straight line, but in a jagged one, 2 good hours followed by a difficult one, a morning where he seemed almost himself, followed by an afternoon where the fever crept back up enough to make Abigail's hands go still over whatever she was doing and her eyes go to his face with that particular focused attention that Silas had come to recognize as her version of fear made functional. The fever didn't return to what it had been on the worst night. It hovered and subsided and hovered again for 4 more days, and during those 4 days the rhythm of the cabin changed completely. There was no question of Abigail managing the kitchen and the larder and the daily work with the same efficiency as before. She was managing Eli, and Silas managed everything else without discussing it, because discussing it would have made it into something that required a decision when it was simply the obvious thing. He cooked. He was bad at it, as he'd always been bad at it, but he was less catastrophically bad than he'd been before October, because he'd been watching her work for 4 months, and some of it had transferred. He didn't burn the beans. He made a passable broth from the smoked pork and the dried vegetables and brought it to her, and she ate it at Eli's bedside without commenting on its quality, which was either tact or exhaustion or both. He did the water, the barn, the wood, the cooking, the washing up. He checked in on her and Eli every few hours, not in a hovering way, but in a factual way, standing in the doorway, looking at both of them, asking one practical question and accepting a one-sentence answer and leaving again. On the third day, she looked up at him from the rocking chair with dark circles under her eyes and said, "You're doing my job." "Temporarily," he said. "You're not as bad at it as you think." The broth was thin. The broth was fine. She shifted Eli, who was sleeping against her. "Silas, you need to sleep. You've been up every night this week." "I sleep." 3 hours isn't sleep." "It's enough." She looked at him with the expression she had when she thought he was being deliberately obtuse. "The cattle need you functional. I need you functional. Go to bed at a reasonable hour tonight." He looked at her. She was telling him to take care of himself because she needed him capable, and she was framing it as practical because that was how she handled things. And underneath the practical framing was the simple fact that she was worried about him, and both of them knew it. "All right," he said. He went to bed that night at 9 o'clock, which was earlier than he'd gone to bed since he was a child, and he slept for 8 hours straight through, which was also unusual. And when he woke, the cabin was already warm and smelled like coffee, and Abigail was in the kitchen with Eli on her hip, and Eli looked at him when he appeared in the doorway with something that was unmistakably recognition. "Better?" he asked. "He kept his breakfast down," she said, "and he pulled himself up on the chair leg twice this morning." She paused. "I think he's turning the corner." She was right. By the end of the week, Eli was himself again, demanding, opinionated about which objects he was allowed to hold, furious when the wooden spoon was taken away for washing. The color was back in his face, and his eyes were sharp and tracking, and the weight Abigail had been carrying visibly in her shoulders for 6 days quietly set itself down. The night she finally slept a full night without waking to check on him, Silas heard it, or rather didn't hear it, the absence of her footsteps at 2 and 4 and 5, and the absence told him something the presence of sound couldn't have. He lay awake a while himself that night, not out of worry, for once, out of something else entirely. The response from Solicitor Haynes arrived in the 3rd week of February, carried up by the same hired writer who'd brought the first letter. Gerald Pratt had apparently made a private arrangement for urgent correspondence to be brought up regardless of the standard supply schedule, which Silas noted and planned to thank him for properly. Haynes had received the documents. He had reviewed them. His assessment was straightforward. The evidence of prior payments, combined with Breck's own letter acknowledging those payments, significantly weakened the outstanding claim. Breck's filed amount was demonstrably incorrect. Haynes had written to Breck's representative pointing this out and requesting a revised accounting. More importantly, Breck had, apparently, not expected anyone to find that letter. "He thought I didn't know," Abigail said. She was reading the solicitor's letter at the kitchen table, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that wasn't defeat. It was something colder than that. "He counted on your not having Thomas's papers," Silas said. "He probably assumed a widow woman with a baby would be too overwhelmed to go through them carefully." She set the letter down. "Or wouldn't know what she was looking at if she did." She wasn't wrong, and she wasn't angry exactly either. She was past anger, had processed whatever anger was available to her somewhere in the long nights of Eli's fever. And what was left was the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had found the ground under her feet and was not going to be moved from it. "What does Haynes recommend now?" Silas asked. "He thinks Breck will negotiate. He says the revised figure, accounting for the $100 already paid, brings the remaining debt to $140, and he believes Breck will accept a structured repayment over 18 months rather than take a contested claim to county court where the outcome would be uncertain for both parties." She looked at the letter. "He also says—" She paused, something shifting in her expression. "He says Breck is not a man of entirely clean reputation. He has 2 other contested debt claims currently being reviewed. Haynes thinks that if pushed, Breck might accept even less than the full amount rather than attract further scrutiny." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He was counting on you not fighting." "Yes." "And you did." She looked up at him. "We did," she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, acknowledging it without making more of it than the moment needed. "Right back to Haynes," he said. "Tell him to push." March came. And with March came the first real signs that the mountain was going to relent. Not warmth exactly, but a softening in the cold, an hour of midday sun that actually carried some small heat in it, a slight settling of the snowpack. The creek, which had been frozen solid since November, began making sounds again, water moving under ice, working its way back toward the surface. Silas noticed these things the way a man noticed them after 12 years on the same mountain, not with drama, but with the particular attentive relief of someone who had survived another winter and was watching the proof of it accumulate. Abigail noticed them differently. He watched her, in those early March days, stand at the kitchen window for longer than usual, looking out at the yard where the snow was starting to show the dirt beneath it in patches, her expression unreadable. He thought he knew what she was looking at. Spring meant the pass road would open. Spring meant Dunbar Crossing became accessible again, and Caldwell beyond it, and the wider world in which a woman with a cook's skills could find employment. Spring meant the original arrangement. She'd come for the winter season, and after that they'd decide, became a question that needed an answer. He didn't raise it. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment, but he was also, honestly, not ready for the conversation, which was a different thing, and one he examined without pride. The Breck matter resolved itself on the 14th of March, a date Silas noted in the ranch log with the same flat notation he gave to everything else. Haynes had negotiated. Breck had folded faster than expected. Apparently the threat of additional scrutiny was more persuasive than Haynes had anticipated. The final settlement was $90, payable in installments of $15 over 6 months, beginning when the pass road opened and banking became possible. $90 was manageable. $90 was, given what Abigail had been owed in wages over the winter, nearly within reach. She came to him with the letter, and he read it and handed it back and said, "Good." "It's done," she said. "It's done." She folded the letter carefully, the way she folded things she intended to keep. Then she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands quiet at her sides, and he could see her processing it, the closing of a door that had been open and cold at her back for months. "Thank you," she said, "for the resources. You found the documents," he said. "You knew what they meant. You offered to back me if I needed it." She met his eyes. "That mattered. Knowing I wasn't—" She stopped. "Knowing I had something behind me." He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure what to do with it, so he let it sit. The problem was that things had a way of accumulating, and Silas Mercer was a man who had lived alone long enough that he'd lost the habit of noticing accumulation until it was too late to pretend it hadn't happened. He noticed it now, in March, when the light was changing and the snow was pulling back and the end of the winter arrangement was approaching like something inevitable. He noticed all the ways the cabin had changed around Abigail and Eli's presence, and understood clearly that it had not changed around him. He had changed around them. He was aware of where she was in the cabin at most hours of the day, not from surveillance, but from the particular attunement that develops between people who share a small space over a long time. He knew the sound of her footsteps, and which creak of the floor meant she'd gotten up in the night, and which meant she was just shifting in the chair. He knew she put too much coffee in the pot when she was preoccupied and not enough when she was settled and content. I knew she talked to Eli more when she was worried about something and less when she wasn't, and the change in frequency told him things about her internal state that she didn't put into words. He knew that she laughed more now than she had in October. The laugh he'd first heard through the kitchen window, the surprised open one she'd had with Eli, had become less rare, though it was never careless. It was always the laugh of someone who expected less and was genuinely pleased by more. He knew that she had stopped flinching when he came into a room suddenly. He'd noticed it early, in November, the slight physical startle when he appeared without warning, a learned response to something from her former life. It was gone now. She simply looked up when he came in. He noticed all of this and kept it to himself because examining what it meant felt like standing at the edge of something and looking down, and he was a man who preferred solid ground under his feet before he committed to a direction. But the ground was shifting, and the spring was coming, and the thing he was not saying was building pressure the way water built under ice, quietly, invisibly, and with a purpose. The particular afternoon things came to a point was in the last week of March, not through any dramatic event, nothing as clean as that. It came through Burl Cotter, who stopped by again on his spring circuit after months away, and whose handling of the situation was clumsy in the specific way of a man who means well and doesn't think before he speaks. Burl came in and stamped his boots and accepted coffee and looked at the cabin with the assessing eye of a man who hadn't been inside it since November. And what he saw was the difference that 5 months had made. The larder labels, the organized shelves, the clean curtains. Abigail had sewn from old grain sacks dyed with the black walnut holes she'd found in the woodpile, the small touches that accumulated into the unmistakable impression of a home rather than a place where a man was merely existing. "Well," Burl said, looking around, "place looks different." "It's been organized," Silas said. "More than that." Burl looked at Abigail, who was at the stove with Eli on her hip, and his expression was more carefully managed this time than it had been in November. He'd learned something from that visit. "Mrs. Foster, how are you getting on up here?" "Well, thank you," she said. She brought him coffee, and there was nothing in her manner toward him but polite distance, which she'd earned the right to. Burl drank his coffee and talked about the trail conditions and the winter's toll on the trapping, and a piece of news from Dunbar. The Caldwell Freight Company was expanding its routes. There was talk of a regular bi-weekly wagon up to the higher ranches, which would make resupply considerably more reliable. Then he looked at Silas and said, with the blundering goodwill of a man who thought he was being helpful, "You'll be looking for a replacement cook then, come spring, once Mrs. Foster heads back down?" The kitchen went quiet. Silas looked at Burl. Abigail had her back to the room, at the stove, and she didn't turn around, and that told Silas everything about how much effort not turning around was costing her. "I haven't decided anything yet," Silas said. His voice came out more measured than he felt. "Just thinking practically," Burl said, oblivious. "Season's ending, road'll be open in a few weeks. Figured you'd be making arrangements." "When I make arrangements, I'll let you know," Silas said. Burl read enough in his tone to let it go. The conversation moved on. He left 20 minutes later with a slab of Abigail's smoked cheese that she'd pressed on him with a politeness that had nothing warm in it. And when the door closed behind him, the cabin went quiet in a particular way. Silas looked at the back of Abigail's head. She was standing at the stove and she wasn't doing anything. Her hands were still. The pot in front of her wasn't being stirred. She was just standing there. "Abigail," he said. "It's a fair question," she said. Her voice was controlled. "What he asked, it's a practical question." "I know." "The season arrangement was through spring." She turned from the stove and her face was composed, which meant she was working to keep it that way. "I haven't wanted to raise it because—" She stopped. "Because I haven't wanted the answer to be what I was afraid it might be." He looked at her steadily. "What were you afraid it might be?" She looked at him for a moment, and something moved in her expression. Not quite fear, but the specific vulnerability of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is accepting the consequences of saying it. That it was over, she said. That spring meant packing up and going back down and finding something else somewhere, and that— She paused. That this was just a winter, and I was just a cook, and Eli was just a child who happened to be here. Silas stood up from the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He'd never been able to arrange words into the kind of eloquence that some men could produce in emotional moments, and he'd long since accepted this about himself. What he could do was say the true thing plainly. "You're not just a cook," he said. "You haven't been just a cook since November." She watched him. "I don't know how to say this the right way," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and I still don't have the right way." He stopped. "But you should know that when I went out on that ridge in February, it wasn't because it was my job. And when I sat at that table for a week making bad broth and doing your work while you sat with Eli, it wasn't because it was practical." He paused. "And when Burl Cotter said what he said just now, the thing I felt wasn't concern about finding a replacement cook." Abigail was very still. "What did you feel?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "Like someone had suggested removing a wall from my house," he said. "And the house was going to be cold and wrong without it." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, the careful way she processed everything, taking the thing apart to check if it was true, not from suspicion, but from the habit of a woman who had been handed things that weren't what they seemed. "Silas," she said, "I need you to understand something." She moved away from the stove and set Eli down on his blanket, and she stood with her hands at her sides in the middle of the kitchen, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had always been steadier than they had any right to be. "I am not a beautiful woman by most reckonings. I know what I look like. I've been told, at considerable length and in considerable detail, what I look like and what that means about my worth. And—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it as a statement of fact and not as a man trying to make you feel better. He held her gaze. I have watched you manage this ranch through the hardest months of a hard year. I have watched you stretch supplies and fix problems and carry water and fight a debt claim with 3 pieces of old paper and hold your child through a fever night that would have broken most people. I have watched you refuse to be diminished by every person who tried to diminish you, starting from the moment you stepped off that wagon and those men started in on you. He paused. That is what I see when I look at you. That is what has been sitting across from me at this table all winter, and that is what I don't want to lose. She stood in the kitchen with her hands still at her sides and her eyes wet and her face completely unmanaged, all the composure gone, which he'd only seen twice before, both times in the worst moments of Eli's fever. And he understood that this was its own kind of crisis for her, this being seen. I'm afraid, she said. I want you to know that. I'm saying yes, but I'm afraid. I know, he said. So am I. She looked at him. You are. I've been alone on this mountain for a long time, he said. Alone is a habit. He stopped. It's safe in certain ways, and you are not safe, Abigail. You matter. That's not safe. She absorbed that. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said. Yes, you understand, or yes to the other thing? Both, she said. And something came through her face then, not the suppressed almost smile he'd been seeing since October, but the real one, unguarded and full and slightly unsteady because her eyes were still wet. Both. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face, and she looked back at him, and neither of them moved for a moment because moments like this deserved the space they needed. Then Eli, on his blanket on the floor, grabbed the edge of Abigail's skirt and pulled himself to standing against her leg, and looked up at both of them with the expression of a child who had achieved something and expected acknowledgement. They both looked down at him. Silas crouched down to Eli's level. Eli looked at him with round, serious eyes, and then, with great purpose, let go of Abigail's skirt and took one unsteady, determined step toward Silas and grabbed his knee. The 3 of them stayed like that for a moment, Eli standing between them, gripping Silas's knee with both hands, looking enormously pleased with himself. Did he just walk? Silas asked. 1 step, Abigail said. Her voice was unsteady. That's a step. That is absolutely a step. Eli thumped back onto the floor and immediately began trying to pull himself up again, entirely unconcerned with the weight of the adult moment he had just walked through. Silas stood back up. He looked at Abigail. She was watching him with something in her face that he'd never seen there before, not the careful composure, not the managed smile, not even the full real laugh, something quieter and more fundamental than any of those. The look of a woman who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to be in a place where she was allowed to be exactly what she was. But the world outside the cabin didn't wait for private moments to find their proper resolution, and the following week reminded them of that with characteristic bluntness. Gerald Pratt sent word up with the first regular supply run of the season. A note, brief and apologetic in Gerald's cramped hand, informing Silas that Carl Breck had apparently had second thoughts about the negotiated settlement. He had filed a new motion with the county court, this one not for the debt itself, but contesting the validity of the evidence Haynes had submitted. His claim was that the letter acknowledging Thomas's payments was a forgery. Abigail read the note at the kitchen table. Silas watched her face. She read it twice. Then she set it down. He's calling me a forger, she said. He's desperate, Silas said. Haynes told you he had other contested claims. He can't afford to lose this one cleanly. I know why he's doing it. She looked at the note. But if the court entertains the motion, if there's a formal hearing, you'd have to go to Caldwell. Yes. She paused. And I'd have to prove the letter's authenticity, which means finding someone who can verify Thomas's handwriting independently. The land office records, maybe. But those are in Caldwell, and we'd need Haynes to access them. And write to Haynes tonight, he said. We need to know exactly what the motion says and what our options are. She looked at him. Silas, this could require a trip to Caldwell, multiple trips, legal fees, time. She paused. I can't keep drawing on. We're not having that conversation again, he said. She looked at him for a moment. We said yes to something, he said. That means this is our problem, not yours. Do you understand that? She was quiet. Do you understand that? He repeated. I'm working on it, she said. It It wasn't a deflection. It was honest, the acknowledgement that understanding it in her head and feeling it in the place where Thomas Foster had done his work were two different things, and the second one was going to take longer. "That's enough," he said. She wrote to Haynes that evening. The letter was detailed and clear and made several observations about the legal strategy available to them that Haynes later described, in his response, as perceptive. He used that word specifically, and Silas noticed that when she read it, she had to read it twice, the same way she'd read things that surprised her. The legal situation remained unresolved as April arrived, and the snow continued its slow withdrawal up the mountain. The pass road opened properly in the second week of April, and with it came the return of the regular freight wagon and the particular renewed possibility of the world that access always brought. Dunbar Crossing, when Silas rode down for the first supply run of the season, was its usual April self. The particular combined energy of people who'd been snowbound all winter and were now encountering each other again in the open air. He did his business at the freight office, collected the supplies, stopped to speak to Gerald. "Heard you kept the Foster woman on through the winter," Gerald said, in the tone of a man who had more to say than he was leading with. "She stayed on," Silas said. Burl Cotter mentioned, "Burl Cotter should mind his own business." Gerald smiled faintly. "Generally agreed. I'm only saying folks have had opinions about the arrangement." He paused. "Nothing mean, just talk." "Folks can talk," Silas said. "Is there anything about my supply order I need to know?" Gerald let it go. But riding back up the mountain, Silas thought about it. He thought about the way Dunbar Crossing processed other people's lives, the way any small settlement did, with a mixture of genuine concern and casual judgment and the particular authority that people felt over situations they were only tangentially connected to. He thought about Abigail having stepped off the supply wagon in October into a gauntlet of that, and having walked through it with her eyes forward. He thought about what he wanted to do about the talk, and what his options were, and what those options would mean. He arrived back at the cabin in the late afternoon. Abigail was in the yard when he rode in, Eli on her hip, checking the state of the kitchen garden she'd started planning in a patch of ground south of the cabin where the snow had retreated earliest. She'd been talking about the garden since February, what she wanted to plant, what would work at altitude, what the season length allowed. She'd drawn a plan of it in her notebook. She looked up when he rode in. "How's the town?" she asked. "Awake," he said, "and talking." She read something in his expression. "About us?" "About the arrangement," he said, which is Gerald Pratt's polite way of saying yes. She was quiet for a moment, adjusting Eli on her hip. "Does it bother you?" He dismounted and tied the horse and turned to look at her in the afternoon light. The April light that was different from every other month's light, thinner and newer, and carrying a different kind of hope in it. "What would bother me," he said, "is if the talking gave you a reason to doubt what you said yes to." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the garden plot was a rough brown square of earth beginning to show, and beyond that, the mountain rose in its permanent gray-white patience, and the creek was running properly now, audible from the yard, the sound of water freed from ice. "It doesn't," she said. He nodded. He began unloading the supply packs. She came to help, shifting Eli to her other hip, reaching for the nearest bundle with her free hand the way she always reached for what needed carrying, as if the question of whether to help had never needed asking. They worked side by side in the yard in the April afternoon, and Eli watched the world from his mother's hip with the focused attention of a child accumulating everything, and the mountain held its silence around them, and none of what was still unsettled, Breck's motion, the county court, the talk in Dunbar, the future's ordinary uncertainties, none of it was resolved. But the person standing beside him was not a hired cook managing a winter contract. She was a woman who had fought for her son and fought for her name, and was now helping him carry supplies into a kitchen that had become, without ceremony or announcement, hers as much as his. That was the fact he was working from. Everything else was weather. The trip to Caldwell was Abigail's idea, and she raised it on a Tuesday morning in the third week of April with the same directness she brought to everything that mattered. Silas was at the table with his coffee and the ranch accounts when she came in from checking on Eli, who was in the yard attempting to walk across a patch of uneven ground with the grim determination of a child who had discovered locomotion and intended to master every surface it offered. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, I need to go to Caldwell. He looked up. Haynes can't resolve the forgery claim without me present, she said. He's written 3 letters saying as much, and I've been waiting, hoping Breck would withdraw the motion, but he won't. He's dug in. She paused. The hearing is scheduled for the 12th of May. If I don't appear, the court will likely rule in Breck's favor by default. I know, Silas said. He'd read Haynes's last letter as carefully as she had. I was waiting to see if you'd bring it up. Why didn't you bring it up? Because it's your matter to decide, he said. Not mine to push. She looked at him. It's our matter. You said so yourself. Yes, he said. But the deciding is yours. She absorbed that. Then, I want you to come with me. He hadn't expected her to ask directly. He should have. She was a direct person. But he'd been half expecting her to frame it as practical, as convenience, as something other than what it was. All right, he said. The ranch? Burl Cotter owes me a favor from 3 winters back. He can check the cattle for a week. He closed the account ledger. When do you want to leave? She let out a breath, slow and deliberate, the kind that means something has been held a long time. Soon as the wagon schedule allows, she said. Gerald runs down on Thursday. Thursday, then. She nodded. Then she looked at the table between them and said more quietly, I've never asked anyone to do something like this for me. Go somewhere on my behalf. It feels... She stopped, searching for the word. Strange, he offered. Uncomfortable, she said, like I'm taking something I haven't earned. He looked at her directly. You earned it in February on a fever night when you were out of options and still didn't fall apart. You earned it every day before that. The discomfort is the old voice, not the true one. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Thomas's voice. Yes. She held his gaze. I'm working on telling the difference. I know you are, he said. You're better at it than you were in October. She almost smiled. That's a low bar. You cleared it by a considerable distance, he said, and she did smile then, real and unguarded, and he picked up his coffee cup because he needed something to do with his hands. They left Thursday morning on Gerald Pratt's freight wagon, Eli bundled against the spring chill and showing tremendous personal interest in everything the world offered from his position on Abigail's lap. The road down the mountain was mud and snow melt and the particular treacherous combination of the two, and the wagon lurched and slid on the worst sections, and Silas rode alongside rather than in the wagon bed because his weight on the slopes made the footing harder for the horses. He watched her from his mare, the way she rode out the lurching without tensing, Eli held secure against her free hand steady on the rail. Practical. Grounded. Not performing calm, but actually possessing it, which was different. Dunbar Crossing was fully awake now in the April thaw. People were out, business was being conducted, the particular social energy of a settlement returning to itself after winter isolation. Several people looked up when the wagon came through. Several of them looked at Abigail. A few of them looked at Silas alongside the wagon and then back at Abigail and made the calculation. None of them said anything. Silas was aware that his presence was part of why, which sat in him with complicated weight, that a woman needed a man beside her before a town would keep its opinions to itself. He didn't like that. It was true, and he didn't like it. They stopped to water the horses, and Silas went to speak to Gerald briefly about the Cotter arrangement, and when he came back, Abigail was standing near the water trough with Eli, and May Dunbar had come out of the store and was talking to her. May's expression was warm and direct, and whatever she was saying was making Abigail stand slightly differently. Not tensed, but held. Received. He stopped and gave them the moment without interrupting it. When May went back inside, he came over. What did she say? She said, Abigail paused. She said she was glad I stayed. She said the mountain has a way of showing you what you're actually made of, and she'd been watching since October and she knew what I was made of. She looked at the water trough for a moment. She said it like it was just a fact, not a compliment. May doesn't do compliments, Silas said. She does assessments. Yes. She shifted Eli. It landed differently because of that. They got the wagon moving again and made the rest of the descent and the 2-day journey to Caldwell without significant incident, unless you counted Eli's absolute refusal to sleep in the roadside inn's traveling crib and the consequent arrangement of all 3 of them in the main room's larger bed, which nobody mentioned in the morning and which Silas thought about for a considerable distance down the road before putting it away somewhere he'd come back to later. Caldwell was a real town, not large by Eastern standards, but substantial by frontier ones, with a proper courthouse and a main street that ran 8 blocks, and a population that didn't know each of its members by sight. Abigail looked at it from the wagon seat with an expression Silas couldn't quite read. "Last time I was here, I was leaving," she said. "Now you're coming back to finish something," he said. She nodded slowly. "Yes." Solicitor Haynes turned out to be a small, precise man in his 60s, with the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human trouble and had organized his responses to them with the same efficiency he brought to his filing system. He met them in his office on the afternoon they arrived, reviewed the situation concisely, and told Abigail what she needed to hear in exactly the right order, what was strong about her position, what was uncertain, and what he needed from her before the hearing. "The forgery claim is in," Haynes said. "Breck's argument is that the letter acknowledging your husband's payments was manufactured after the fact. To counter it, we need to establish the letter's authenticity through independent verification of the handwriting, and we need to establish your credibility as a witness." "My credibility?" Abigail said. "Yes." Haynes looked at her without apology. "You're a widow woman claiming a dead man's debt was partially settled, on the basis of documents that the creditor says are fabricated. A court will look at you and make assessments. That's the reality of it." "What assessments will they make?" she asked. Haynes considered her carefully. "That depends considerably on how you present yourself," he said, "which, based on this conversation, I expect will be fine." Silas said nothing. He watched Abigail process this, the casual weight of it, the fact that her credibility was an object being evaluated by people who didn't know her, would never know her the way a winter on a mountain made a person known. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Tell the truth simply and completely," Haynes said. "Don't elaborate when you don't need to. Don't apologize for what you don't know. Answer the question asked." He paused. "And bring that ledger page." They were in Caldwell for 4 days before the hearing. Haynes used 2 of those days to locate the land office records containing Thomas Foster's registered signature from the original farm claim filing, and to arrange for the county clerk, who had processed that filing and remembered Thomas Foster, to appear and verify the handwriting against the letter. On the second day, while Haynes was managing the document verification, Silas took Abigail and Eli to the land office himself to look at the filed records. Not because it was necessary, because she'd asked if she could see them. She stood at the counter and looked at Thomas Foster's signature on the farm claim document, his handwriting in ink, permanent and official, his name written on a piece of paper that had survived him, and her expression was the one she had when she was processing something that sat alongside grief without quite being grief. "He wasn't all bad," she said. Not to Silas specifically, just saying it to the air. There were good months, good seasons. He could be very kind when things were going well." She paused. "He just couldn't manage himself when they weren't, and things were usually not going well." Silas stood beside her and said nothing. "I'm not mourning him," she said. "I want you to know that. I mourned him in the right season and I'm done with it. But he was Eli's father, and he was my husband, and he was a real person, not just a collection of his worst parts." She looked at the signature for another moment. "I'm just trying to hold all of it at once." "That's harder than only holding one part," he said. "Yes." She stepped back from the counter. "All right, I've seen what I needed to see." The hearing was on a Thursday morning. Breck was already in the courthouse when they arrived. A heavy-set man in his 50s with the particular expression of someone who had expected less resistance and was recalibrating. He looked at Abigail when she came in, and the look was the assessing kind, the kind that went from her face to her figure and made a calculation, and Silas watched it happen and felt the familiar quiet anger that had no useful target. Abigail didn't look at Breck at all. The proceeding was not dramatic in the way dramatic things are in stories. It was a county court hearing with a judge who had 17 other matters on his docket and wanted this one resolved efficiently. Haynes presented the letter, the land office records, the clerk's verification of the handwriting. Breck's representative argued the forgery claim with considerably less conviction than the written motion had implied, possibly because Haynes had written to Breck's representative the previous week with a pointed note about the other contested claims currently under review and the scrutiny that a public court proceeding might bring to all of them. The judge called Abigail to speak. She stood in front of him and answered every question simply and directly, without elaborating when she didn't need to, and without apologizing for what she didn't know. She described finding Thomas's papers. She described the letter from Breck and what it said. She described the ledger notations in Thomas's handwriting and what they meant. She did not perform distress, and she did not perform confidence. She was simply herself, which was a steadier thing than either performance. The judge asked her once whether she had any reason to believe her late husband had deliberately deceived her about the settlement of the debt. She was quiet for a moment. "My husband had a habit of believing his own best version of a situation," she said. "I think he told me the debt was settled because he intended to settle it and had convinced himself the intent was the same as the fact. That's not the same as deliberate deception. It's a different problem." She paused. "But the outcome for me was the same." The judge looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something down. Breck's representative made a brief closing argument that had the quality of something going through motions. Haynes's response was concise and confident. The judge ruled before noon. The forgery claim was dismissed. The remaining debt of $140, already reduced from Breck's original inflated figure, was confirmed as legitimate and payable under the negotiated installment terms Haynes had arranged. Breck was ordered to pay the court costs of the hearing, which the judge noted had been made necessary by a claim that the evidence did not support. They walked out of the courthouse into the April sun, all three of them, Haynes slightly ahead, consulting his pocket watch. And Abigail stopped on the courthouse steps and stood there for a moment with Eli on her hip and the sun on her face. Silas stopped beside her. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She looked out at Caldwell's main street, at the people in the wagons, and the ordinary busy life of a town that had existed before her and would exist after her and had never known her name. She looked at it with an expression he understood, the particular look of someone who has been under a weight for so long that its removal doesn't feel like relief immediately. It feels like strangeness, like the body hasn't caught up to the news yet. "I want to go home," she said. It was the first time she'd used that word for the mountain ranch. Home. She said it without seeming to notice she'd said it, which was why it landed in him the way it did. Not as a declaration, but as the most natural thing she'd said in months, the word choosing itself because it was simply the accurate word. "We leave tomorrow morning," he said. "Gerald's wagon runs north on Fridays." She nodded. She shifted Eli, who was reaching for a passing dog with enormous interest. She looked at Silas. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know I said it before. I'm saying it again." "I know. I mean..." She stopped, tried again. "I mean, thank you for being someone who comes. Not everyone is. I didn't know that until I found one." He looked at her in the April light. This woman who had arrived on a supply wagon in October with one travel bag and a 9-month-old and nowhere left to go, and had proceeded to become the fixed point around which everything in his life had quietly reoriented itself. "Neither did I," he said. They were back on the mountain by Saturday evening. The ride up the pass was the reverse of the descent in every meaningful way. The mud and snowmelt were the same, the lurching of the wagon was the same, but the light was different and the direction was different, and Silas, riding alongside, found himself watching the mountain rise above them with the feeling of a man returning to something that belonged to him, rather than a man going back to where he lived, and he understood that the difference between those two things was significant. Burl Cotter had kept his word. The cattle were managed, the barn was in order, nothing had gone wrong in their absence. He was gone before they arrived, having left a note on the table in his cramped handwriting that said only, "Cattle fine. Back fence needs work, south corner. BC." Silas showed the note to Abigail and she read it and said, "That's actually rather sweet, in Burl's way. Don't tell him that." "I wouldn't dare." She put Eli down in the kitchen and he immediately pulled himself to standing on the chair leg and then walked. 3 steps now. He was up to 3 reliable steps. Across to the table and grabbed its leg with both hands and looked around at the familiar kitchen with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. Abigail looked at her son and then she looked at the kitchen. The labeled shelves, the copper-sleeved water pipe, the curtains dyed with walnut hulls, the garden plan still pinned to the wall above the counter. And she looked at all of it the way a person looked at something that had been made by their own hands over a long time. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but made. "I want to plant the garden this week," she said, "while the ground's ready." "I'll turn the soil Monday," he said. The South Plot's been sitting long enough. She nodded. She started unpacking the travel bags with the efficient, familiar movements of a woman at home in a space. And Silas went to check on the cattle because 12 years of habit didn't stop for emotional moments. And the evenings settled over the mountain the way evenings did. Slowly, from the peaks down, the light going amber and then gray, and then the particular blue dark of high-altitude dusk. When he came back in, supper was on the table. He stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The table set for two, Eli in his crate chair between them, the lamp lit, the smell of actual food. And he thought about the man who had sat at this table alone for 4 years, eating scorched beans and dried meat and calling it enough. He hadn't known what enough was then. He thought he did. He'd been wrong. May moved through the mountain in the particular way of high country spring. Not warm so much as insistently alive. Things pushing up through ground that had been frozen for 6 months. The creek running fast and cold and clear, the cattle restless and hungry for new grass. Silas worked from first light until the light failed, the kind of sustained work that spring on a ranch demanded. And Abigail was beside him in the ways she could be, and managing the cabin and Eli in the ways she had to be, and the days accumulated with the purposeful momentum of a season that had things to accomplish. The garden went in during the first week of May. She'd planned it through 3 months of winter evenings, and it showed. The layout was efficient and intentional. What would get the most of the limited sun at altitude? What would provide through the shoulder seasons? What would supplement the winter larder most usefully? Silas turned the soil and she directed the planting with the same practical specificity she brought to everything, and Eli sat at the garden's edge in the dirt and was furiously occupied with it. On the day they planted the last row, she straightened up from the ground and pushed the hair from her face with the back of her wrist and looked at the turned earth with an expression that was tired and satisfied and something else. "My mother had a garden," she said. "Not this big. She said if you could grow something from nothing, you could survive anything." She looked at the rows. I didn't really believe her when she said it. "Do you now?" She looked at him. "I believe that growing something from nothing takes longer than you think and more failure than you plan for, and the results are never quite what you pictured." She paused. "And that it's still worth doing." He thought about that. About the things on this mountain that had grown from nothing over a winter. The copper sleeve on the water pipe, the organized larder, the 3 steps Eli could walk now reliably, the practice Abigail had built in distinguishing Thomas's voice from the true one. The thing between them that had no name yet, but was real and present, and putting down roots in the same quiet, gradual way. Everything real put down roots. "Yes," he said, "that sounds about right." The matter of what they were to each other, formally, in the eyes of the law and of Dunbar Crossing and of all the practical structures that governed a life on the frontier, was a conversation that they had, finally, in the second week of May on an evening when Eli was asleep and the kitchen was quiet and the spring dark outside the window was full of the sound of the creek running. It wasn't dramatic. Neither of them was a person who staged moments. Silas raised it the way he raised most things, directly, after thinking about it long enough that he knew what he meant to say. "I've been thinking about the practical situation," he said. She looked up from the cooking log she was updating. "Which aspect?" "All of it. You're not hired help. You're not a winter arrangement. What you are to this ranch and to me doesn't have a formal name yet, and I'd like to give it one." She closed the notebook. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "I'm not asking for the reason people usually ask," he said. "Not because of the talk in Dunbar, or because I need a wife to run the household, or because it solves a practical problem. I'm asking because what we've built here is real, and I don't want it to be provisional anymore." He paused. "I want Eli to grow up knowing the ground under his feet is solid." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most Silas Mercer way anyone has ever proposed anything," she said. He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" "I'm getting there." She folded her hands on the notebook. "I need to say something first." "All right." "I'm not the woman I was in October," she said. "I know that sounds obvious, but I mean something specific by it. In October, I would have said yes to that because I was afraid to say anything else. I would have folded myself into whatever shape was needed because that's what I knew how to do." She paused. "I'm not going to do that. If I say yes now, it's because I want this. Because this is the life I'm choosing, not the life I'm settling for." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know the difference." "I know the difference," he said. I know you do. I'm saying it for me. He waited. Yes, she said. That's my yes. The chosen kind. He nodded once, and then, because he was not a man of speeches, but he was a man capable of the one true thing when it mattered. I know what you look like, Abigail. I know what you look like and what you sound like at 2 in the morning when you're scared, and what you look like when you're actually laughing, and how you problem solve, and how you carry a grudge, and how you carry grief, and how you carry a baby up a steep trail in the snow. I know you, and I'm asking because of all of it, not in spite of any of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were wet. She didn't apologize for it. All right, she said softly. All right. They were married in Dunbar Crossing on the first Saturday of June by the county judge who made a circuit through the settlements once a month, in the small side room of the trading post that May Dunbar had cleared and swept for the occasion. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Abigail wore her best dress, which was not a wedding dress, but which was clean and carefully pressed, and Silas wore his good coat and had shaved that morning without being asked to. Eli, who was 11 months old and newly in possession of 4 reliable walking steps, wore a clean shirt and spent most of the proceeding trying to reach the button on May's sleeve. Burl Cotter was there. Gerald Pratt was there. May Dunbar was there and did not cry, which was consistent with her character, but her expression during the whole proceeding was one of uncomplicated approval, which from May was equivalent to a standing ovation. There were other people too, more than Silas had expected, if he was honest. People he knew from the valley ranches and the trading routes. People who had heard things through the ordinary channels of a small settlement's information and had come, he understood, because they wanted to see it. Some of them had been among the ones who'd watched Abigail step off the supply wagon in October. He noticed that, and he thought she noticed it too, though neither of them mentioned it. Afterward, May put food out. Not Abigail's food for once, but May's own cooking, which was an act of deliberate generosity because May's food was good and offering it was saying something. People ate and talked, and Eli was passed from arm to arm with the cheerful cooperation of a child who had recently figured out that more people meant more attention, and the afternoon went on in the way good afternoons went on. Not perfectly. Someone spilled something. Burl said the wrong thing at one point and got a look from his wife that corrected him. Silas stood slightly apart from the room for a while because crowds were still uncomfortable for him, even small ones, but fully, humanly. At some point in the late afternoon, Abigail found him near the back wall where he'd retreated to have 5 minutes of quiet, and she stood beside him with Eli on her hip and looked out at the room with him. All right? She asked. Getting there, he said, using her phrase back at her. She looked at him sideways. You said that on purpose. Yes. She almost laughed. Then she did laugh, that real one, and leaned her shoulder against his briefly, and Eli looked at his mother laughing and laughed too, the whole-body laugh he'd had since October, the one that had first come through the kitchen window. The summer was a working one. Everything on a mountain ranch in summer was work. The cattle, the fences, the garden. Abigail tended with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The supply runs, the preparations that summer required if winter was going to be manageable rather than survival. Silas had known all of this work before. He knew it differently now, with 2 people doing it instead of 1, and with a child in the yard who was walking fully by July and fell down approximately 40 times a day, with the cheerful resilience of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of falling. Eli walked toward everything with his whole body, arms slightly out for balance, face concentrated and intent. He fell and got up and walked again. He did not look to see if anyone was watching. He simply went toward the next thing. Silas watched him sometimes from the fence line or the barn door and thought about what kind of man that child was going to be, growing up in the place where he had fought for his life on a February night and had walked his first steps in a mountain kitchen and had never known a day when someone wasn't present who was glad he existed. He thought about what it meant to a person, that last thing, to grow up knowing that. He hadn't had it, neither had Abigail. They'd both had to learn it sideways, slowly, in the middle of adult lives that had tried to teach them other things. Eli was going to start with it, built in, the bedrock underneath everything else. That seemed like the most important thing they could give him. The first payment to Breck came out of Abigail's summer earnings, counted carefully and handed to Haynes's representative when the circuit rider passed through in July. $15. She handed it over without ceremony, And that was the end of the first installment and the beginning of the last chapter of Thomas Foster's debts, which would be fully discharged by winter. She told Silas about it that evening, matter-of-factly, and he nodded, and she went back to the stove, and nothing more was said about it because nothing more needed to be said. It was a thing being finished. Finishing things was its own satisfaction, separate from drama. The summer riders who passed through the mountain ranches began stopping at the Mercer place with increasing frequency, not for supplies, which they could get in Dunbar, but for meals. Word had moved through the trails the way word moved through the frontier, informally and unstoppably. The Mercer Ranch, 3 hours up the East Pass. The woman there could cook in a way that made a man remember what food was supposed to be. Abigail had not set out to become known for this. It happened because she cooked the same way she did everything, with full attention and without waste, and with the particular generosity of someone who understood what it meant to be hungry and cold and in need of something that tasted like more than survival. She never turned anyone away. She never charged what the food was worth. She sent riders on with something in their pack bags without being asked. Silas watched this happen over the summer and said nothing about it, because there was nothing to say except that it was exactly what he should have known would happen. And he had known, if he'd thought about it, which meant that some part of him had understood from very early on what kind of person he'd let climb down off that supply wagon. In September, a full year since Gerald Pratt had sent word to the Caldwell Employment Office about a mountain rancher who needed a cook, Silas and Abigail sat on the porch in the evening after Eli was in bed, in the particular quiet that falls when a summer's work is mostly done, and the first cold of the new season is arriving, and there is a moment, not long, not guaranteed, where a person can sit still and take account. The valley below was going gold. The cattle were in good weight. The garden had produced well enough to supplement the winter stores materially. The fences were tight. The water line had a copper sleeve on every vulnerable joint now, because Abigail had done the rest of them herself in August with the leftover copper sheet and the knowledge from the one they'd done together in December. "Burl Cotter told me something this week," Abigail said. Silas looked at her. "He said that before I came up the mountain, he'd been quietly worried about you." She paused. "He said you were," he used the word fading, "that you were functional, but something was going out in you, and he'd noticed it and hadn't known what to do about it." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong," he said. "I'd gotten very efficient at being alone. Efficiency isn't the same thing as all right." "No," she said, "it isn't." She looked out at the valley. "I had the opposite problem. I'd gotten very efficient at making myself small enough not to draw attention, at taking up the least possible space, at managing everything alone because asking for help it was what you did when you had no other choice, not something you did because other people were actually worth trusting. And now?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "Now I garden on land I didn't own a year ago," she said. "Now I have a son who walks toward everything without looking back to see if it's safe, and I think he gets that from his mother. I just didn't know it until I saw it in him." She paused. "Now I have a person beside me who went out in -20 because my child needed medicine and didn't ask for anything back, and I'm still learning how to receive that without looking for the cost." "There isn't a cost," he said. "I know. That's the part that's hard to learn." She turned to look at him. "The things that are actually good don't ask for anything back. They're there. Every day they're just there, and eventually you stop waiting for the part where it's taken away." He looked at her face in the last of the evening light. The woman who had held herself very still on a supply wagon while men said things they didn't think she could hear, who had walked into a cold cabin and turned it into a warm one by the simple force of who she was, who had fought a debt claim with 3 pieces of old paper and won, who had held her son through a fever night and had never, in all of it, once asked for pity. He thought about what she'd said, about what was actually good not having a cost. He thought about the men in Dunbar Crossing who had laughed, and about Thomas Foster, who had told this woman at considerable length what she was worth. He thought about the particular damage that did, not the dramatic kind of damage that healed clean, but the insidious kind that worked on the inside, that made a person question what they deserved before they'd even finished forming the thought. And he thought about the winter just past, which had asked them both for everything they had, and about what remained after it. Not despite the difficulty. Because of it. Because the things you build in hard seasons with limited materials, where every decision matters, and there's no room for pretense, Those things have a different weight than the things built easily. They hold differently. They know what they're made of. People had a version of that, he thought. Some people, the ones who could carry water up a steep trail and stop for 10 seconds and then keep going. The ones who didn't look at the men who mocked them, not because they hadn't heard, but because they'd made a private decision about where to spend their strength. The ones who brought a notebook to a mountain and kept records, who found the 3 documents that mattered in a pile of paper that didn't, who stood in a county courthouse and answered every question simply and without apology. Strength wasn't always fast or loud or obvious. That was the thing he'd understood all winter, watching her, and it was the thing he couldn't have been told. He'd had to see it to know it, had to watch her carry something in every ordinary day that most people never had to carry, and do it without putting it down or asking anyone to admire how long she'd been holding it. What she was, he thought, was the kind of person that life tried very hard to diminish, and failed. He was glad she'd climbed down off that wagon. He was glad he'd looked up when the laughter started. He was glad that on the worst night of February he'd known where the plants grew on the North Ridge, and gladder still that he'd gone. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad the wagon stopped here too," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned slightly into his shoulder, the way she sometimes did now in the evenings, without making anything of it. Just present, just there, just the simple weight of another person choosing to be next to you. They sat like that while the valley finished going dark below them, and the first stars came out above the ridge, and the mountain settled into its enormous, indifferent night around one small porch, one lit window, one child sleeping inside who would wake in the morning and walk toward whatever the day held with his arms slightly out and his face completely open. The mountain would have its winters. There would be others. There always were, on high ground. More cold nights, more difficult seasons, more things that tested the strength of whatever you'd managed to build. But some things, built carefully in hard conditions by people who refused to be small, held. Some things just held.